Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the endless stretches of American highways where 8 new disturbing true horror stories have emerged from the asphalt wilderness. These are not folklore whispered around truck stop counters or sensationalized tales crafted for entertainment. Instead, we present first-hand testimonies of terror that have been rigorously documented through police incident reports, emergency dispatch recordings, and medical records from trauma centers across the interstate system. Each narrative comes directly from survivors who trusted the open road, only to discover that the most dangerous predators hunt where civilization ends and the highway stretches into darkness. From the desolate truck stops of Route 66 to the fog-shrouded mountain passes of Interstate 70, and from the endless cornfields of the Midwest to the ghost towns scattered along forgotten state routes, these accounts reveal the terrifying reality that lurks between destinations. The testimonies you will hear tonight have been compiled through extensive interviews with survivors, collaboration with highway patrol units, and careful analysis of missing persons cases that span multiple states. To protect those brave enough to share their experiences, certain identifying details have been carefully modified while preserving the chilling authenticity of each encounter. If you are new to our archive of buried horrors, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for authentic horror content that exposes the darkness hiding in plain sight across America. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another buried file from the shadows of reality. My name is David and I am from Oregon. The incident I am about to share with you happened during what should have been a wonderful family vacation 5 years ago. My wife Sarah and I had planned a road trip with our 2 children, Emma, who was 8 years old at the time, and Jake, who was 6. We were driving from Portland to visit Sarah's parents in Salt Lake City, taking the scenic route through Idaho on Interstate 84. Sarah and I had been looking forward to this trip for months. We rarely got the chance to take extended vacations due to our work schedules, and the kids were at perfect ages to appreciate the adventure of a cross-country road trip. We had packed our Honda Odyssey with snacks, games, and entertainment systems to keep Emma and Jake occupied during the long drive. The first day of travel went exactly as planned. We made good time through the Columbia River Gorge and into Idaho, stopping at a few scenic overlooks to let the kids stretch their legs and take pictures. Emma and Jake were being surprisingly well behaved for such a long car ride, and Sarah and I were feeling optimistic about the remainder of our journey. It was on the second day, somewhere between Boise and Twin Falls, that we first encountered the van that would turn our family vacation into a nightmare. I first noticed it when we stopped for lunch at a roadside restaurant in a small Idaho town whose name I cannot even remember now. The van was parked across the street from the restaurant, and I only paid attention to it because it was an unusual vehicle. An older model Dodge van painted an ugly shade of brown with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. What caught my attention initially was not the van itself, but the fact that someone appeared to be sitting in the driver's seat even though the engine was not running. I could make out the silhouette of a person behind the wheel, but the tinted windows made it impossible to see any details about who was inside. After our lunch, we loaded the family back into the Honda and continued down the highway. About an hour later, I noticed the brown van again in my rearview mirror. It was maintaining a consistent distance behind us, perhaps 6 or 7 car lengths back. At first, I assumed it was just coincidence. After all, Interstate 84 is a major highway, and it made sense that other vehicles would be traveling in the same direction we were. But as the miles passed, the van remained behind us at exactly the same distance. When I sped up slightly to test my suspicions, the van sped up as well. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When we took an exit to stop for gas, the van took the same exit and pulled into a parking spot across the street from the gas station. I pointed out the van to Sarah, and she initially tried to convince me that I was being paranoid. She suggested that the driver was probably just traveling to the same general area we were, and that it was natural for vehicles to end up following each other on long stretches of highway. But when we left the gas station and merged back onto the interstate, the brown van pulled out behind us and resumed its position 6 car lengths back. By this point, I was becoming genuinely concerned about our family's safety. Over the next 100 miles, I experimented with different driving patterns to see if the van would continue following us. I changed lanes frequently, varied my speed, and took an unnecessary exit just to see what would happen. Every single time, the van mirrored our movements exactly. When we took the unnecessary exit, the van followed us down the off-ramp and through a small town before following us back to the highway. There was no longer any doubt in my mind that we were being deliberately followed. Sarah was now sharing my concerns, but we tried not to alarm Emma and Jake. We told them we were playing a game to see if we could spot interesting vehicles on the highway, and we asked them to help us keep an eye on the brown van with the dark windows. Emma, being the older and more observant of our children, immediately spotted the van and asked why it was always behind us. I told her that some people just happened to be going to the same place as we were, but I could tell she was starting to sense that something was wrong. As we approached Twin Falls, I decided to take decisive action. Instead of continuing straight on the interstate as we had planned, I took an exit that led to a large truck stop and travel plaza. My plan was to see if the van would follow us, and if it did, I would go inside and call the police. The van followed us into the truck stop parking lot, but instead of parking nearby, it drove to the far end of the lot and positioned itself where the driver would have a clear view of our vehicle. I told Sarah to take the kids inside the travel plaza and buy them snacks while I stayed with the car to observe the van. After Sarah and the children went inside, I pretended to be checking something under the hood of our Honda while actually watching the van. For about 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then the driver's door of the van opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, probably in his 40s, with unkempt hair and clothing that looked like it had not been washed in days. What alarmed me most was that he immediately began walking directly toward our vehicle, pulling something out of his jacket pocket as he approached. I quickly got into the driver's seat and locked all the doors. As the man got closer, I could see that what he had pulled from his pocket was a camera, and he was taking pictures of our license plate, our vehicle, and even of me sitting in the driver's seat. When he realized I was watching him, he did not try to hide what he was doing. Instead, he walked right up to my driver's side window and started taking pictures of me through the glass. He was close enough that I could see his face clearly, and what I saw there was deeply disturbing. He was smiling, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed frightening other people. I started the engine and backed out of the parking space, but the man did not move away from the car. He continued taking pictures as I maneuvered around him, and he followed our vehicle on foot as I drove toward the travel plaza entrance to pick up my family. When Sarah emerged from the building with Emma and Jake, I quickly explained what had happened. The man was still visible in the parking lot, now standing next to his van and continuing to take pictures of us with a telephoto camera lens. Sarah immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. We loaded the children into the car as quickly as possible, and I drove straight to the truck stop's management office. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Janet, listened to our story with obvious concern and immediately called the local sheriff's department. While we waited for the police to arrive, Janet told us that this was not the first time they had received reports about the brown van and its driver. According to her, there had been at least 3 other incidents over the past 6 months where families traveling with children had reported being followed by the same vehicle. She also revealed something that made my blood run cold. Two of those families had reported that after their encounters with the van, they had discovered evidence that their hotel rooms had been broken into during the night, though nothing had been stolen. The intruder had apparently gone through their belongings and taken photographs of personal items, including the children's clothes and toys. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they immediately recognized my description of the van and its driver. Deputy Martinez told us that the man was a registered sex offender named Thomas Kellner, who had recently been released from prison after serving 8 years for attempted kidnapping. The deputies explained that Kellner had been targeting families with young children, following them for hundreds of miles while photographing them and learning their routines. His apparent goal was to identify families who would be staying overnight at motels, then break into their rooms while they slept. According to Deputy Martinez, Kellner's method was to follow families until they stopped for the night, then wait several hours before attempting to enter their motel rooms. He would photograph the children and their belongings, and in at least 2 cases, he had attempted to abduct children from their beds while their parents slept. The deputies immediately put out an alert for Kellner's van, and within 2 hours he was apprehended at a rest area about 50 miles down the highway. When they searched his vehicle, they found hundreds of photographs of families with children, detailed notes about travel patterns and motel stops, and what appeared to be a kidnapping kit including zip ties, duct, tape, and sedatives. The investigation revealed that Kellner had been operating this stalking scheme for months, targeting families on major interstate highways throughout the Mountain West. He had compiled detailed files on dozens of families, tracking their movements and photographing their children without their knowledge. Most disturbing of all, the police found evidence that Kellner had successfully entered the motel rooms of at least 6 families over the previous 4 months. In each case, he had photographed the sleeping children and stolen personal items as souvenirs. The families had never known they had been victimized because Kellner was careful not to wake anyone or leave obvious signs of his presence. Kellner was charged with multiple felonies, including stalking, burglary, possession of child pornography, and attempted kidnapping. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The experience fundamentally changed how our family approaches travel and personal safety. We no longer stay at roadside motels, instead choosing established hotel chains with better security measures. We vary our travel routes and timing to avoid predictable patterns, and we always inform family members of our exact itinerary and expected arrival times. Most importantly, we taught Emma and Jake about situational awareness and the importance of immediately reporting anything that makes them feel uncomfortable or unsafe. The incident showed us how vulnerable families can be when traveling, and how predators can exploit the routines and patterns of highway travel. I still think about that brown van whenever we take family road trips. The knowledge that Thomas Kellner had been watching our children and planning to harm them is something that will stay with me forever. But I am grateful that we recognized the danger in time and that our family remained safe. The investigation into Kellner's activities revealed that dozens of other families had been victimized without ever knowing it. Our willingness to report the stalking behavior and take immediate action may have prevented him from harming other children. And for that reason, I encourage any travelers who notice suspicious behavior to trust their instincts and contact law enforcement immediately. Evil exists in this world, and sometimes it follows families down dark highways, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But awareness, caution, and quick action can make the difference between a close call and an unthinkable tragedy. My name is Marcus, and I am from Denver, Colorado. What I am about to share with you happened 3 years ago during what should have been a simple road trip to visit my college buddies in Phoenix. I have replayed this nightmare in my head countless times, and I still get chills whenever I drive past that stretch of highway where my life nearly ended. It was late October and I had finally gotten some time off from my job at a local marketing firm. My college friends had been planning a reunion weekend in Phoenix for months, and I was excited to see everyone again. We had all graduated 5 years earlier and scattered across the country, so opportunities like this were rare. Rather than fly, I decided to make a road trip out of it. The drive from Denver to Phoenix is about 12 hours, and I figured I could make good time driving through the night to avoid the heavy traffic during the day. I left Denver around 10 in the evening, planning to arrive in Phoenix by mid-morning. The weather was perfect for a night drive, clear skies with no wind, and my car was running beautifully. I had just gotten my Honda Civic serviced the week before, so I felt confident about making the journey without any mechanical issues. I loaded up on energy drinks and snacks, created the perfect playlist, and hit the road feeling optimistic about the adventure ahead. The first few hours went exactly as planned. I made good time through Colorado Springs and Pueblo, then crossed into New Mexico without incident. The highway was relatively empty, just the occasional semi-truck and a few other night travelers like myself. I was making excellent time and felt wide awake despite the late hour. Everything was going perfectly until I reached that desolate stretch of Interstate 25 between Las Vegas, New Mexico and Albuquerque. It was around 2 in the morning when I first saw him. A lone figure standing beside a broken-down sedan on the shoulder of the highway, illuminated by my headlights as I approached. He was waving his arms frantically, clearly in distress. As someone who has been helped by strangers before, I have always believed in paying it forward when possible. Despite the late hour and remote location, something inside me compelled me to pull over and offer assistance. The man appeared to be in his 40s, average height and build, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. His car, an older model Toyota Camry, sat with its hood up and hazard lights blinking weakly. As I rolled down my window, he approached with what seemed like genuine relief and gratitude. "Thank God someone stopped," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "My car just died on me about 20 minutes ago. The engine just cut out completely. I do not have cell service out here, and I was starting to worry I would be stuck until morning." I looked around at the empty highway stretching endlessly in both directions. The nearest town was at least 30 miles away, and there was nothing but darkness and desert surrounding us. I felt genuinely sorry for the guy and knew how helpless I would feel in his situation. "I am heading to Phoenix," I told him. "I can give you a ride to the next town where you can call for a tow truck or find a hotel for the night." His face lit up with apparent appreciation. "That would be incredible, thank you so much. I am actually heading to Phoenix too, believe it or not. I have business there in the morning, so this is perfect timing." Something about his immediate mention of Phoenix seemed oddly convenient, but I brushed off the feeling as paranoid thinking brought on by the late hour and isolated location. People travel to Phoenix all the time, especially for business. It was not that unusual of a coincidence. He grabbed a small duffel bag from his car and climbed into my passenger seat. As we pulled back onto the highway, I tried to make polite conversation to help pass the time and keep myself alert for the remaining drive. "So what kind of business brings you to Phoenix?" I asked casually. "Sales," he replied simply. "I travel around the Southwest meeting with clients. What about you?" "Just visiting some college friends for a reunion weekend. We all went to Arizona State together." That was when things started to feel wrong. His response was too quick, too specific. "Arizona State, interesting. What did you study there?" I had not mentioned Arizona State. I had only said college friends in Phoenix. The realization hit me like a cold wave, but I tried to stay calm and not let my growing unease show. Business marketing, I answered, watching his reaction carefully. Makes sense. I bet you and your friends had some great times in Tempe. That area around campus can get pretty wild on weekends. Again, I had never mentioned Tempe or anything about the campus area. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as my mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe he just made educated guesses based on Phoenix and college friends. Arizona State was the largest university in the area, after all. But then he continued talking, and every word made my blood run colder. I bet you guys spent a lot of time at that sports bar on Mill Avenue. What was it called? Oh right, you probably went to Marley's a lot too. Great wings there. I had never mentioned Mill Avenue, and Marley's had been our regular hangout spot during college. It was not some famous establishment that everyone knew about. It was just a local place near campus that we frequented because they had cheap beer and decent food. How do you know about Marley's? I asked directly, no longer trying to hide my suspicion. He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel his eyes studying my profile in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. I know a lot of things about you, Marcus. More than you might expect. The use of my name sent ice through my veins. I had never introduced myself. I had been careful not to mention my name during our entire conversation. My mind immediately went to the worst possibilities. Was this some kind of setup? Had he been waiting for me specifically? How do you know my name? I demanded, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. Instead of answering, he reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a manila folder. Even in the dim light from the dashboard, I could see it was thick with papers and photographs. He opened it and began laying items on his lap where I could see them. Marcus Thompson, age 27, graduated from Arizona State in 2022 with a degree in marketing. Currently employed at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions in Denver. Lives alone in an apartment on Colfax Avenue. My throat went completely dry. Everything he said was accurate down to my address and employer. But it got worse. He continued pulling out photographs. Pictures of me leaving my apartment building, walking to my car, even sitting at my desk at work. They appeared to have been taken over several weeks or months. Some were clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a significant distance. You take the same route to work every morning. You stop at the Starbucks on 16th Street exactly 3 days a week. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You order a large coffee, black with 1 sugar. You typically arrive at work between 8:15 and 8:30. I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. This was not a random encounter. This man had been stalking me, studying my habits, learning my routines. But why? And how had he known I would be on this highway at this exact time? You posted on Instagram 2 weeks ago about your upcoming trip to Phoenix, he said, as if reading my thoughts. You mentioned leaving Friday night to beat the traffic. Your privacy settings are not as secure as you think they are. The full horror of my situation began to dawn on me. This was not a stranded motorist I had helped out of kindness. This was a predator who had orchestrated this entire encounter. He had probably disabled his own car and waited for me to drive by, knowing my route and approximate timing from my social media posts. What do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through possible escape options. That depends entirely on how cooperative you are willing to be, he replied calmly. You see, Marcus, you fit a very specific profile that I have been looking for. Young professional, lives alone, limited family contact, predictable habits. Someone who would not be missed immediately if they disappeared for a while. The phrase "for a while" was particularly chilling. It implied this was not necessarily a kidnapping with the intent to kill, but something potentially worse. Prolonged captivity for some unknown purpose. I glanced at the speedometer and realized I was still doing 75 miles per hour down a dark, empty highway with a dangerous stranger in my passenger seat. My phone was in the cup holder between us, but he would see any attempt to reach for it. Even if I could call for help, we were in the middle of nowhere with no specific location to give emergency services. "The next exit is in 12 miles, he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "You are going to take that exit and follow my directions from there." I knew that if I allowed him to direct me off the highway to some secondary location, my chances of survival would drop to nearly zero. Whatever he had planned required privacy and isolation. I had to act while we were still on the interstate, where there was at least a possibility of other travelers or police patrols. My mind went through every option I could think of. I could try to crash the car deliberately, hoping to survive while incapacitating him. I could attempt to fight him while driving, though that would likely result in a fatal accident. I could try to attract attention by driving erratically or honking the horn, but there were no other vehicles visible in either direction. Then I remembered something that gave me hope. About 15 miles ahead was a travel plaza, a large truck stop with gas stations, restaurants, and hopefully people even at this hour. If I could make it there without him realizing my intention, I might have a chance to escape or call for help. "You know what?" I said, trying to sound resigned and cooperative. "I think I understand what this is about. You are right that I would not be missed right away. My friends in Phoenix are not expecting me until tomorrow afternoon, and I live alone, like you said." I was hoping to buy time and make him think I was accepting the situation. Meanwhile, I was calculating distance and time to reach the travel plaza. At our current speed, I had maybe 10 minutes before we reached the exit he mentioned, and the truck stop should be just a few miles beyond that. "Smart man," he said approvingly. "This will go much easier if you do not try to be a hero." But as we approached the exit ramp, I could see the glow of lights ahead, the travel plaza I had been hoping for. It appeared to be busy, with several semi-trucks parked in the lot and multiple vehicles at the gas pumps. This was my chance. Instead of slowing for the exit, I accelerated and flew past it at nearly 80 miles per hour, heading directly for the truck stop. My passenger immediately realized what was happening. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "I told you to take that exit." "Change of plans," I replied, pressing the accelerator to the floor. He lunged for the steering wheel, but I was ready for that reaction. I grabbed his wrist with my right hand while steering with my left, and we struggled briefly before I managed to pull into the truck stop parking lot. I was honking the horn continuously and flashing my lights, trying to attract as much attention as possible. Till at the moment I stopped the car, I jumped out and started yelling for help. Several truckers immediately came running over, and within minutes we had called 911. My passenger had initially tried to follow me out of the car, but when he saw the crowd gathering, he retreated back to the vehicle. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found detailed surveillance files on not just me, but dozens of other potential victims. The man was wanted in connection with several missing persons cases across multiple states. His method was always the same: extensive surveillance followed by staged encounters designed to look like coincidental meetings. I learned later that his car had not actually broken down. It was equipped with a kill switch that allowed him to disable it temporarily to create the appearance of mechanical failure. He would research his targets through social media, learn their travel plans, and position himself along their route at the optimal time and location. The investigation revealed that I was not his first intended victim from Colorado. 3 other young professionals had disappeared over the past 2 years under similar circumstances, and their cases remained unsolved. If I had not made it to that truck stop, I would have become the 4th. I still take road trips, but I have made significant changes to how I travel. I no longer post travel plans on social media. I vary my routes and timing, and I never pick up hitchhikers no matter how genuine their distress appears. Most importantly, I trust my instincts when something feels wrong, because that night taught me that predators are often far more sophisticated and patient than most people realize. The experience changed my perspective on random acts of kindness and personal safety. While I still believe in helping others when possible, I have learned that evil can disguise itself as vulnerability, and sometimes the person asking for help is actually the greatest danger you will ever encounter. My name is Jessica, and I am from Michigan. 3 years ago, my boyfriend Derek and I made the decision to pack up our entire lives and move from Detroit to Seattle. Derek had landed his dream job at a tech startup, and I was ready for a change of scenery after spending my whole life in the Midwest. We decided to make the cross-country move an adventure by driving rather than flying and shipping our belongings separately. Derek had this old CB radio that his father had given him years earlier. It was a classic Cobra model from the 80s that still worked perfectly. Derek was fascinated by truckers and the whole CB culture, so he convinced me that we should install it in our Honda Pilot for the journey. His reasoning was that truckers would have the best information about road conditions, traffic jams, construction delays, and good places to stop for food and fuel. I was initially skeptical about the CB radio idea. It seemed old-fashioned and unnecessary when we had smartphones with GPS and traffic apps. But Derek was so excited about using it that I agreed to let him install it before we left Detroit. He spent an entire weekend running cables and mounting the radio and antenna, treating the whole project like he was building a spaceship. We left Detroit on a Thursday morning in early September, planning to take our time and make the drive over 4 days with overnight stops in interesting cities along the way. The first day took us through Illinois and into Iowa, and Derek was having a blast with the CB radio. He learned the trucker lingo quickly and was soon chatting with drivers about everything from weather conditions to the best truck stops for showers and meals. Initially, I found the CB radio chatter entertaining. The truckers had a whole culture and language of their own, and many of them were genuinely helpful and friendly. They warned us about speed traps, construction zones, and accidents ahead. Derek adopted the handle Motor City, and I became Detroit Lady in their conversations. Everything was perfectly normal until we reached Nebraska on the second day of our journey. That was when we first heard from the voice that would change everything about our trip. It was around 2 in the afternoon, and we were driving through a particularly desolate stretch of Interstate 80 when a clear, authoritative voice came through the CB radio speaker. "Motor City and Detroit Lady, this is Watchdog. You need to copy this message immediately." Derek and I looked at each other with surprise. No one had ever addressed us so directly and seriously on the CB before. The voice had an urgency that was unsettling. This is Motor City," Derek replied hesitantly. "Go ahead, Watchdog. You are currently driving a silver Honda Pilot with Michigan plates, license number starting with GK7. You have approximately 40 miles until you reach the Ogallala rest area. Do not stop there under any circumstances. Continue driving until you reach the truck stop in Big Springs. Do you copy?" My blood ran cold. This person, whoever they were, knew exactly what vehicle we were driving and had somehow read our license plate. Derek and I exchanged worried glances as he grabbed the CB microphone. "How do you know what car we are driving?" Derek asked, his voice showing the concern we both felt. "That is not important right now," Watchdog replied firmly. "What matters is that you follow my instructions exactly. Do not stop at the Ogallala rest area. There is a situation developing there that puts travelers at risk, particularly couples in late-model vehicles with out-of-state plates." I grabbed Derek's arm and whispered urgently, Ask him what kind of situation. Derek keyed the microphone again. What kind of situation are we talking about here, Watchdog? There was a long pause before Watchdog responded. When he did speak again, his voice was even more serious than before. There are individuals at that rest area who target specific types of travelers. They work in teams to disable vehicles or create emergencies that strand people. Once travelers are vulnerable, they rob them and worse. I have been monitoring their communications, and your vehicle matches the profile they are looking for today. My hands were shaking as I processed this information. Derek, we need to call the police, I whispered. But when Derek asked Watchdog if we should contact law enforcement, the response was not what we expected. Negative on contacting local authorities. The situation is more complicated than you realize. Just trust me and avoid that rest area. I will continue to monitor your progress and provide updates as needed. As we approached the area Watchdog had warned us about, we could see the Ogallala rest area ahead. It looked completely normal from the highway, just a standard roadside facility with a few cars and trucks parked in the lot. But Derek and I had decided to trust Watchdog's warning, so we drove past without stopping. About 10 miles later, Watchdog's voice crackled through the CB again. Motor City and Detroit lady, you made the right decision. I can confirm there were 3 individuals at that rest area who were waiting for your vehicle specifically. They had disabled the security cameras and positioned themselves to intercept you. How could you possibly know all this? Derek asked into the microphone. I have my methods, Watchdog replied cryptically. What matters now is keeping you safe for the remainder of your journey. You will encounter 2 more potentially dangerous situations before you reach Colorado. Over the next several hours, Watchdog continued to provide warnings and guidance. He told us to avoid a specific truck stop in Colorado where he claimed there was an active situation involving federal authorities. He warned us away from a seemingly innocent roadside diner where he said the owners were connected to human trafficking operations. Each time, his warnings seemed absurd and paranoid, but each time, when we drove past the locations he had flagged, something felt wrong. The truck stop he had warned us about was surrounded by more law enforcement vehicles than seemed normal. The roadside diner had several men in the parking lot who were clearly not customers, and they watched our vehicle intently as we drove by. As we continued into Colorado, I began to feel like we were being protected by some kind of guardian angel, even though the logical part of my mind questioned how any of this could be possible. How could someone track our location so precisely? How could they know about dangerous situations at specific locations along our route? On the 3rd day of our trip, as we drove through the Rocky Mountains, Watchdog provided his most chilling warning yet. Motor City and Detroit lady, in approximately 15 miles, you will see a sedan pulled over on the side of the highway with its hood up. There will be a woman standing next to it who appears to be in distress. Do not stop to help her. This is a trap. A trap? Derek asked. What kind of trap? The woman is not actually stranded. She is working with a team of men who are positioned out of sight. When Good Samaritans stop to help, the men emerge and force the victims into the mountains where they are never found. Colorado State Patrol has been investigating a series of disappearances along this stretch of highway, but they have not yet identified the pattern. Sure enough, exactly 15 miles later, we saw the broken-down sedan with a woman standing beside it waving for help. She looked genuinely distressed, and under normal circumstances, Derek and I would have definitely stopped. Instead, we drove past, both of us feeling guilty for not helping someone who appeared to need assistance. As we passed the scene, I looked in my side mirror and saw 2 men emerge from behind some rocks near the roadside. They appeared to be signaling to the woman by the car. My stomach dropped as I realized Watchdog had been absolutely correct again. "Watchdog, we just passed the scene you warned us about," Derek said into the CB microphone. "You were right. There were men hiding nearby." "I know," Watchdog replied simply. "You are safe now, but you need to maintain your current speed and do not stop until you reach Grand Junction. There is one more situation ahead." The final warning came as we approached the Utah border. Watchdog told us that there was a compromised way station where vehicles were being randomly selected for searches that resulted in planted evidence and extortion schemes. He directed us to take an alternate route that added an hour to our journey but avoided the problematic checkpoint entirely. By the time we reached Salt Lake City, Derek and I were completely dependent on Watchdog's guidance. We had witnessed enough evidence to convince us that his warnings were legitimate, even though we still had no idea who he was or how he was obtaining his information. As we prepared to leave Utah and enter Nevada for the final leg of our journey, Derek tried one more time to get information about our mysterious protector. "Watchdog, we want to thank you for everything you have done to keep us safe. Can you tell us who you are? We would like to find a way to repay you for your help." The response took a long time to come, and when it did, Watchdog's voice sounded different somehow, more tired and sad than before. "Motor City and Detroit lady, I am someone who was not as fortunate as you have been. I was traveling with my wife on this same route 2 years ago, and we did not have anyone to warn us about the dangers. We stopped at the wrong place and trusted the wrong people. My wife did not survive the encounter, and I was left permanently disabled." Derek and I sat in stunned silence as Watchdog continued. "I monitor CB communications and track vehicles that match certain risk profiles because I do not want any other families to experience what happened to mine. I have prevented dozens of incidents over the past 2 years, but I can never bring back the person I lost." "We are so sorry for your loss," Derek managed to say. "Is there anything we can do to help you? Just reach your destination safely and remember to help others when you can. That is payment enough." We heard from Watchdog one final time as we entered Nevada. He confirmed that the remainder of our route was clear and wished us well in our new life in Seattle. After that, despite Derek's attempts to reach him, we never heard his voice on the CB radio again. Derek and I made it to Seattle safely and began our new life together. We never forgot about Watchdog and the mysterious protection he provided during our vulnerable journey across the country. We tried several times to research disappearances and incidents along Interstate 80 to see if we could verify the dangers he had warned us about, but we found very little concrete information. What we did find were scattered reports of missing persons cases, unsolved robberies, and suspicious activities at various locations along major interstate routes. While we could never prove that Watchdog's specific warnings were accurate, the pattern of incidents suggested that his concerns were legitimate. Derek kept the CB radio installed in our vehicle, and occasionally we would try to contact Watchdog to see if he was still out there protecting other travelers. We never heard from him again, but sometimes late at night, when we were driving on long trips, we would hear fragments of conversations that reminded us of his voice. I still think about Watchdog whenever Derek and I take road trips. There is something both comforting and unsettling about knowing that someone might be watching over travelers, protecting them from dangers they cannot see. But it also makes me aware of how vulnerable we all are when we venture into unfamiliar territory, trusting strangers and hoping for the best. The experience changed how Derek and I approach travel and personal safety. We are more cautious about where we stop, more aware of our surroundings, and more grateful for the protection we received during that journey. Most importantly, we try to help other travelers when we can, honoring Watchdog's memory and continuing the cycle of protection he started. My name is Amanda, and I am from Texas. What I am about to tell you happened 2 years ago during one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I still cannot drive alone at night without thinking about what occurred on that dark stretch of highway between Houston and Roswell, New Mexico. This experience challenged everything I thought I knew about reality, and I am sharing it now because I believe others need to hear what can happen when the veil between worlds becomes thin on America's loneliest roads. My grandmother had been my closest companion throughout my entire life. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7 years old, and she had been my constant source of love and wisdom for the past 20 years. When I received the call that she had suffered a massive stroke and was not expected to survive the night, I knew I had to get to her bedside in New Mexico as quickly as possible. It was already past 9 in the evening when I hung up the phone with the hospital staff, but I could not bear the thought of waiting until morning to begin the journey. My grandmother had always been there for me in my darkest moments, and I was determined to be there for her in what might be her final hours. The drive from Houston to Roswell normally takes about 8 hours, but I was hoping to make it in 7 by driving through the night and avoiding any unnecessary stops. I threw some clothes into an overnight bag, grabbed my purse and car keys, and headed out into the darkness. The first few hours of the drive were exactly what I expected. Interstate 20 took me west through the familiar landscape of East Texas, and I made good time despite the late hour. I had the radio playing softly and was using the drive to prepare myself emotionally for what I might find when I reached the hospital. It was somewhere around midnight after I had crossed into New Mexico and was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway between Roswell and Artesia that I first noticed something was wrong. I was adjusting my rearview mirror when I caught sight of a figure sitting in the back seat of my car. My immediate reaction was panic. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, my heart pounding as I turned around to confront whoever had somehow gotten into my vehicle. But when I looked back at the rear seat, it was completely empty. I sat there for several minutes trying to rationalize what I had seen. I told myself that it must have been a trick of the light, or shadows from passing traffic, or just my imagination playing tricks on me due to stress and exhaustion. I had been driving for nearly 4 hours, and grief can do strange things to a person's perception. After checking that all my doors were locked and looking around the empty highway for any signs of other people, I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I pulled back onto the interstate and continued toward Roswell. But about 20 minutes later, I saw the figure again. This time, I was certain it was not my imagination. In my rearview mirror, I could clearly see the silhouette of an elderly woman sitting directly behind me in the back seat. She appeared to be wearing a dark dress or coat, and her gray hair was pulled back into a bun. I tried to remain calm and not take my eyes off the road, but every few seconds I would glance in the mirror to see if the figure was still there. Sometimes she was visible and sometimes the back seat appeared empty, but I could sense her presence even when I could not see her. What disturbed me most was not just that someone was apparently in my car, but that I felt no sense of immediate danger. If this had been an intruder or carjacker, I would have expected to feel threatened or frightened. Instead, I felt an odd sense of familiarity, as if the presence in my back seat was someone I should recognize. As the miles passed, the figure became more solid and visible. I began to make out details of her face and clothing that were impossible to ignore. She appeared to be in her 70s or 80s, with kind eyes and weathered hands that she kept folded in her lap. Her clothing looked old-fashioned, like something from several decades ago. The most unsettling moment came when I realized that the woman in my back seat was moving objects around the interior of my car. I watched in my rearview mirror as she picked up my cell phone from where I had placed it on the center console and examined it carefully before setting it back down. She opened my purse and looked through its contents, not as if she were searching for something specific, but more like she was trying to understand who I was. At one point, she picked up a photograph that I kept clipped to my sun visor. A picture of my grandmother and me taken at Christmas the previous year. The phantom woman studied the photograph for a long time, and I swear I saw her nod as if she recognized something or someone in the picture. By this time, I was convinced that I was either experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown or encountering something genuinely supernatural. Neither possibility was particularly comforting, but I was still several hours away from Roswell and had no choice but to continue driving. It was around 2:30 in the morning when the phantom woman finally spoke to me. Her voice came from directly behind my right ear, clear and unmistakable despite the impossibility of the situation. "You are Sarah's granddaughter," she said. It was not a question, but a statement of recognition. I nearly drove off the road in shock. Sarah was my grandmother's name, but I had never mentioned it aloud during the entire drive, and the phantom woman could not have known this information through any normal means. "Yes," I managed to reply, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know my grandmother?" "I have been waiting for her for a very long time," the woman replied. "She was supposed to meet me many years ago, but she never came. I have been traveling this road ever since, looking for her." The implications of what she was telling me were beginning to sink in. Are you dead?" I asked. "I died in 1987, she confirmed matter-of-factly. "My name is Margaret Fletcher, and your grandmother and I were best friends when we were young women. We made a promise to each other that whoever died first would wait for the other before moving on. But Sarah never came to meet me, so I have been waiting on this highway where I died." My grandmother had indeed lived in New Mexico as a young woman before moving to Texas to marry my grandfather. She had mentioned a childhood friend named Margaret who had died in a car accident, but I had never heard the full story of their friendship. "My grandmother is dying tonight," I told the phantom. "That is where I am going, to the hospital in Roswell." Margaret was quiet for a long time before she responded. "Then perhaps it is time for both of us to complete our journey." For the remaining 2 hours of the drive, Margaret told me stories about her friendship with my grandmother. She described adventures they had shared as teenagers, dreams they had discussed about their futures, and the promise they had made to always be there for each other, even in death. As we approached Roswell, Margaret began to fade from view, becoming more and more translucent until I could barely see her outline in the rearview mirror. But her voice remained clear and comforting. "Tell Sarah that Margaret kept her promise," she said. "Tell her that I waited for her, and now we can go together." When I arrived at the hospital at dawn, I rushed to my grandmother's room expecting to find her unconscious and near death as the doctors had described. Instead, I found her awake and alert, with a peaceful expression on her face that I had never seen before. "Amanda, dear," she said when she saw me, "I am so glad you made it safely. I was worried about you driving alone at night on those dark highways." I sat down beside her bed and took her hand. "Grandmother, I have a message for you. Margaret says to tell you that she kept her promise and that she waited for you." My grandmother's eyes filled with tears and she squeezed my hand tightly. "You met Margaret?" "Oh, my dear child, that means it is time." She passed away peacefully that afternoon with me holding her hand and a smile on her face. The nurses said they had never seen someone transition so calmly and with such obvious peace. I have driven that same stretch of highway several times since my grandmother's death, but I have never again seen Margaret Fletcher or experienced anything supernatural. I believe that she fulfilled her promise to wait for my grandmother, and that both of them have now moved on to whatever comes after this life. The experience taught me that there are forces in this world that we do not understand, and that love and loyalty can transcend even death itself. On America's darkest highways, where the living travel through the night with their own urgent purposes, sometimes the dead are traveling too, keeping promises made long ago and waiting patiently for their time to continue their journey. I no longer fear driving alone at night because I know now that we are never truly alone on the road. Sometimes our guardian angels are people we have never met, spirits who choose to watch over the living because they understand the importance of reaching the people we love before it is too late. My name is Kevin and I am from Florida. The incident I am going to describe happened 3 years ago when I was 22 years old and had just graduated from the University of Florida with a degree in computer science. I had landed my first real job at a software company in San Diego, California, and I was excited to start this new chapter of my life. Instead of flying across the country, I decided to make the cross-country drive an adventure and take the scenic route through some of America's most beautiful landscapes. I had always been someone who enjoyed solitude and exploration, so the prospect of driving alone for several days through different states appealed to me. My plan was to take Interstate 10 west through Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona before cutting north to California. I wanted to see the desert Southwest and experience some of the small towns and local culture that you can only encounter when traveling by car. Everything went perfectly for the first 2 days of my journey. I made it through Louisiana and most of Texas without any problems, stopping overnight in small motels and eating at local diners where the food was authentic and the people were friendly. I was having exactly the kind of adventure I had hoped for when I planned this trip. It was on the 3rd day, somewhere between San Antonio and El Paso, that my car started making unusual noises. I was driving through a particularly remote stretch of highway when I began to hear a grinding sound coming from somewhere under the hood. The temperature gauge was climbing higher than normal, and I could smell something that might have been burning oil or coolant. I am not mechanically inclined, so I had no idea how to diagnose or fix whatever was wrong with my Honda Civic. The nearest town, according to my GPS, was still 40 miles away, but I spotted a small auto repair shop just a few miles ahead at an exit that seemed to lead to nothing but empty desert and a single building with a hand-painted sign that read Pete's Auto Repair. The shop looked like something from a different era. A small concrete building with 2 garage bays and a collection of old cars and trucks in various stages of disrepair scattered around the property. There was no town visible anywhere nearby, just this isolated business sitting beside a lonely highway exit in the middle of nowhere. A man emerged from one of the garage bays as I pulled into the gravel parking area. He was probably in his 50s with graying hair and hands stained with motor oil. He had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his entire life working with his hands in the desert sun. "Looks like you might be having some trouble there, son," he said as I got out of my car. His voice had a friendly drawl and he seemed genuinely concerned about my situation. I explained the symptoms I had been experiencing, the grinding noise, the climbing temperature, and the burning smell. He listened carefully and nodded knowingly, like he had seen this type of problem many times before. "That sounds like it could be your water pump or maybe a bearing in the engine," he said. "Either way, you do not want to keep driving on it or you will end up with a seized engine and a much bigger problem. Let me take a look at it for you." His name was Pete Morrison, and he had been running this repair shop for over 20 years. He explained that he specialized in helping stranded travelers who encountered mechanical problems while crossing this isolated stretch of highway. According to him, the extreme heat and long distances between towns in this part of Texas created perfect conditions for automotive breakdowns. Pete seemed knowledgeable and trustworthy, so I agreed to let him diagnose the problem. He pulled my car into one of his garage bays and spent about 30 minutes examining the engine while I waited in his small office area. The office was cluttered with automotive manuals, invoices, and various car parts, but it felt authentic and lived in rather than suspicious. When Pete returned from examining my car, his expression was serious. "I am afraid it is your water pump, just like I suspected. The bearing has failed, and if you keep driving, you are going to overheat the engine and cause permanent damage. The good news is that I have the parts to fix it. The bad news is that it is going to take me most of the day to complete the repair." I was disappointed by the delay, but I understood that automotive repairs take time, especially in a small shop with limited resources. Pete seemed honest and competent, and I did not have many alternatives given my location. "There is a motel about 20 miles down the road where you can stay the night," Pete suggested. "Or if you want to save some money, I have got a small apartment above the shop that I sometimes rent out to stranded travelers. It is nothing fancy, but it has a bed and a bathroom, and you would be right here when I finish the repair." The apartment option seemed convenient and economical, so I agreed to stay there overnight. Pete showed me up a narrow staircase to a small but clean living space above the garage. It had a bed, a small table and chair, a mini refrigerator, and a bathroom with a shower. The accommodations were basic but adequate for one night. Pete went to work on my car while I settled into the apartment and tried to get some work done on my laptop using my phone's data connection. I could hear him working below, the sounds of tools, an air compressor, and occasionally some music from a radio. Everything seemed normal and professional. It was when I went downstairs around 6 in the evening to check on his progress that I first noticed something disturbing. Pete was not in the garage with my car, so I walked around the building looking for him. I found him behind the shop, and he appeared to be burning something in a metal barrel. As I got closer, I could see that he was burning papers and what looked like personal items: wallets, purses, photographs, and identification cards. The smell was acrid and unpleasant, and Pete seemed startled when he realized I was watching him. "Just cleaning out some old paperwork and lost and found items," he explained quickly. "You know how it is. Stuff accumulates over the years and you have to dispose of it eventually." But as he spoke, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. Among the items he was burning, I could clearly see several driver's licenses with photographs of young people around my age. They looked recent, not like old lost and found items that had been accumulating for years. I tried to act casual and uninterested, but my mind was racing as I returned to the apartment. I began to think about how isolated this location was, how Pete had convinced me to stay overnight instead of going to a motel, and how convenient it was that he happened to have the exact parts needed to fix my car. I decided to investigate further while Pete was still occupied outside. I quietly made my way down to the garage and began looking around more carefully than I had before. In a toolbox near my car, I found a collection of car keys, dozens of them, far more than any legitimate repair shop would need. But the discovery that truly terrified me was hidden in a cabinet in Pete's office. Behind some automotive manuals, I found a shoebox containing driver's licenses, credit cards, and personal photographs of young people. There were at least 30 different identities represented, both male and female, all appearing to be college-aged travelers. The most chilling item in the box was a hand-drawn map showing locations in the desert where bodies could be disposed of. The map included detailed notes about soil conditions, accessibility, and distance from roads and hiking trails. I realized that Pete Morrison was not just a mechanic who helped stranded travelers. He was a predator who targeted young people traveling alone through this remote area. The isolated location of his shop was perfect for his purposes, and his mechanical expertise allowed him to create the very breakdowns that brought victims to him. My hands were shaking as I carefully returned everything to where I had found it and made my way back to the apartment as quietly as possible. I needed to escape immediately, but my car was partially disassembled and would not run. Pete had my keys and I was 20 miles from the nearest town with no transportation. I waited until after midnight when I could no longer hear any sounds from below, then quietly made my way back down to the garage. I searched through Pete's workspace until I found my car keys, then spent nearly an hour trying to reassemble enough of my engine to make the car drivable. I am not sure how I managed to get the water pump reconnected well enough to function temporarily, but desperation gave me mechanical abilities I did not know I possessed. I knew the repair would not last long, but I only needed to reach the next town and contact the police. I managed to start my car and drive out of Pete's garage without waking him. The engine was making terrible noises and the temperature was climbing rapidly, but I pushed it as hard as I could toward the distant lights of the nearest town. I made it to a truck stop just as my engine finally seized completely. The truckers there helped me contact the police, and within 2 hours a team of officers was on their way to Pete's auto repair. They found Pete Morrison attempting to flee in a pickup truck loaded with evidence of his crimes. The investigation revealed that he had been killing stranded travelers for over 15 years, using his isolated repair shop as the perfect hunting ground. The police recovered the remains of 23 victims buried at various locations in the desert. Pete had kept souvenirs from each of his victims, and his detailed records helped investigators solve missing persons cases dating back nearly 2 decades. Pete Morrison was eventually sentenced to death for his crimes, though he died in prison before his execution could be carried out. The case became known as the Highway Predator Murders and led to increased awareness about the vulnerabilities faced by solo travelers in remote areas. I still think about that night whenever I take long road trips. The experience taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong and to always inform others of my travel plans and expected arrival times. Most importantly, I learned that evil can hide behind a friendly face and a helpful demeanor, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to strike. The American highway system connects our vast country and enables incredible adventures, but it also creates opportunities for predators who understand how to exploit the trust and vulnerability of travelers in distress. We must remain vigilant and remember that sometimes the person offering help is actually the greatest danger we will ever encounter. My name is Rachel and I am from New York. What I am about to tell you happened 4 years ago during what was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway to Vermont with my best friend Lauren. This experience challenged everything I thought I knew about reality and the laws of physics. I am sharing this story because I believe there are places in our world where the normal rules do not apply, and travelers need to be aware that not every road on the map leads to where you think it will take you. Lauren and I had been friends since college, and we tried to take at least one weekend trip together each year to catch up and escape from our demanding jobs in Manhattan. That October, we decided to drive up to Vermont to see the fall foliage and spend a couple of days hiking and relaxing at a bed and breakfast in Stowe. We left the city on a Friday afternoon, planning to take our time and enjoy the scenic drive through upstate New York and into Vermont. Lauren had borrowed her boyfriend's SUV for the trip, and we were both excited about getting away from the urban chaos for a few days. The drive started perfectly. We made it through the worst of the city traffic and were soon cruising through the beautiful autumn landscape of the Hudson Valley. The leaves were at peak color, and we stopped several times to take photographs of the stunning scenery. It was around 6 in the evening when we encountered the construction zone that changed everything. We had been following Interstate 87 north when we came upon a series of orange signs indicating that the highway was closed ahead due to emergency bridge repairs. Traffic was being detoured onto a series of local roads that would eventually reconnect with the interstate about 30 miles north. The detour signs directed us off the highway and onto a state route that I had never heard of before. According to our GPS, this alternate route would add about 40 minutes to our journey, but it promised to take us through some beautiful countryside that we might not have seen otherwise. Lauren was driving and I was navigating using both the GPS and a paper road atlas that we had brought as backup. The state route we were following was well maintained and clearly marked, so we were not particularly concerned about getting lost. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. We passed through a small town with the typical Vermont architecture: white church steeples, covered bridges, and colonial houses with perfectly manicured lawns. The scenery was exactly what we had hoped to see on our fall foliage trip. But then something began to feel wrong. According to our GPS, we should have been approaching another small town. But instead, we found ourselves driving through an area that seemed increasingly remote and wild. The houses became fewer and farther between, and the forest pressed closer to the road on both sides. The first thing I noticed was the fog. It seemed to come out of nowhere, rolling across the road in thick gray waves that reduced our visibility to just a few yards. Lauren slowed down considerably, and we both started feeling uneasy about continuing forward. "This is weird," Lauren said, peering through the windshield at the swirling mist. The weather forecast did not mention anything about fog today. I checked our GPS again, but the screen was showing something impossible. According to the device, we were no longer on any recognized road. The display showed our position as a blinking dot in the middle of what appeared to be empty wilderness, with no roads or landmarks nearby. "That cannot be right," I said, trying to refresh the GPS signal. "We have been following the detour signs exactly." As we continued through the fog, we began to notice other strange things. The road signs we passed were written in languages that neither Lauren nor I recognized. They were definitely not in English, French, or any other language we had ever seen before. The symbols looked almost hieroglyphic, but they were clearly modern road signs with reflective surfaces and standard shapes. The mile markers were even more disturbing. Instead of normal numerical sequences, they seemed to be counting backwards, and the numbers themselves looked wrong somehow, like mathematical symbols from a different universe. "Rachel, look at this," Lauren said, pointing to a road sign ahead. "What does that say?" The sign appeared to be indicating a town or destination, but the name was written in those strange symbols we could not read. Below the unreadable text, however, there was something even more unsettling: a date that read 1847 in normal Arabic numerals. "Why would a modern road sign have a date from the 19th century on it?" I asked. But Lauren had no answer. As we drove deeper into the fog, we began to encounter other vehicles on the road, but they were not like any cars or trucks we had ever seen before. Some appeared to be horse-drawn carriages, while others looked like automobiles from different historical periods. Model T Fords, cars from the 1950s with massive tail fins, and vehicles that seemed futuristic in design. The most disturbing encounter came when we passed what appeared to be a family in a station wagon from the 1970s. The people inside looked normal enough, but as we drove by, they turned to stare at us with expressions of confusion and fear, as if our modern SUV was the strange and out-of-place vehicle. "Lauren, I think we need to turn around," I said, my voice betraying the panic I was beginning to feel. "This is not normal. None of this makes sense." But when Lauren tried to find a place to make a U-turn, we discovered that the road had somehow become a divided highway with concrete barriers preventing us from crossing to the other side. We had not seen any construction or warning signs indicating that the road configuration had changed, but we were now trapped traveling in one direction. The fog continued to thicken and our visibility dropped to almost zero. Lauren was driving at barely 20 miles per hour, following the taillights of an old Packard that had materialized in front of us. The driver of the Packard seemed to know where he was going, so we decided to follow him rather than risk driving blind through the mist. It was then that we began to see the figures alongside the road. They appeared to be people, but they were translucent and seemed to be gesturing to us, trying to communicate something urgent. Some were dressed in clothing from different historical periods, while others wore what looked like accident victims, still wearing torn and bloody garments. One figure, a young woman in a 1960s-style dress, ran alongside our car for several hundred yards, pounding on Lauren's window and pointing frantically ahead of us. Her mouth was moving as if she were shouting something important, but we could not hear any sound. "They are trying to warn us about something," Lauren said, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "I think we are in serious trouble." The ghostly figures became more numerous and more agitated the farther we traveled. They were all pointing in the same direction, towards something ahead of us on the road that we could not yet see through the fog. Suddenly, the Packard in front of us slammed on its brakes and swerved violently to the left. As the fog cleared for just a moment, we could see why. The road ahead simply ended, not at a bridge or intersection, but just stopped, as if someone had cut it off with a giant knife. Beyond where the pavement ended, there was nothing but empty space and clouds. Lauren hit the brakes hard, and our SUV skidded to a stop just yards from the edge of the road. We sat there in stunned silence, staring at the impossible sight before us. We were somehow driving on a highway that existed in midair, suspended over what appeared to be a vast canyon or void. The ghostly figures surrounded our car, and now we could see them clearly. They were all accident victims, people who had driven over that same edge and fallen to their deaths. They had been trying to warn us, to save us from joining their eternal vigil on this impossible road. One of the spirits, an elderly man in a suit from the 1940s, approached Lauren's window and placed his translucent hand on the glass. When he spoke, we could somehow hear his voice inside our heads rather than through our ears. "You must turn back," he said. "Follow the lights behind you. Do not look back once you start moving. This road does not belong in your time." Lauren managed to reverse the SUV and turn around, despite the concrete barriers that had somehow disappeared. As we drove back through the fog, following distant lights that seemed to be guiding us, the ghostly figures waved farewell and gradually faded from view. The fog began to lift, and the strange road signs changed back to normal English text. The mile markers returned to their proper sequence, and our GPS suddenly showed our correct location on a normal Vermont state highway. When we finally reached the interstate and continued to our destination, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We had somehow driven onto a highway that existed outside of normal space and time, a road that collected lost travelers from different historical periods and led them to their doom. We never found any record of the road we had traveled on that night. The detour signs that had led us there were gone when we returned home, and construction officials insisted that no emergency bridge repairs had been scheduled for that weekend. Lauren and I still take our annual trips together, but we never deviate from major highways, and we always travel during daylight hours. We learned that there are roads in this world that do not appear on any map. Highways that exist in the spaces between reality, where the lost and the dead continue their eternal journeys. Some detours lead to destinations that were never meant for the living, and sometimes the best navigation tool is the wisdom to turn around when the road ahead seems too strange to be real. The ghostly figures who saved us that night continue to watch over that impossible highway, warning other travelers before they too become permanent residents of a road that leads nowhere. My name is Robert and I am from Arizona. I have been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years, and in that time I have seen and heard things that would make most people question their sanity. The incident I am going to describe happened 2 years ago during what should have been a routine delivery run from Phoenix to Chicago. This experience taught me that the CB radio can be both a lifeline and a trap, and that sometimes the voice asking for help on the airwaves belongs to someone who should never be trusted. I have always loved the freedom of the open road and the independence that comes with being a long-haul driver. There is something peaceful about driving through the night with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional chatter on the CB radio to keep you company. Over the years, I have made many friends through that radio, fellow drivers who look out for each other and share information about road conditions, weather, and places to stop for food and fuel. The CB radio culture among truckers is something special. We have our own language, our own code of ethics, and our own way of watching out for one another. When a driver is in trouble, whether it is a mechanical breakdown or a medical emergency, the trucking community rallies to help. That sense of brotherhood and mutual support is one of the things I love most about this profession. It was a Thursday evening in late November when I left Phoenix with a load of electronics bound for a distribution center outside Chicago. The weather forecast looked good, and I was planning to make the run in 3 days with overnight stops in Flagstaff and Kansas City. I had made this route dozens of times before, so I was not anticipating any problems. The first day went exactly as planned. I made good time across Arizona and into New Mexico, stopping only for fuel and the required rest breaks. As night fell, I was approaching Albuquerque when I first heard the voice that would change everything about my trip. Breaker 19, this is Lost Highway looking for any eastbound drivers who might be able to lend a hand, came a clear voice over Channel 19. The caller sounded like a middle-aged man, and his tone suggested he was genuinely distressed about something. I keyed my microphone and responded, "This is Desert Eagle eastbound on I-40 near Albuquerque. What kind of help do you need, Lost Highway?" "Desert Eagle, thank God someone answered," he replied with obvious relief. "My rig broke down about 30 miles east of your position. Engine just quit on me completely, and I do not have cell service out here. I have got a load of perishables that needs to get to Denver, and I am running out of time." I have been in similar situations myself, so I understood his urgency. When you are hauling perishable goods, every hour counts, and a breakdown can cost you thousands of dollars in spoiled merchandise. "What is your exact location, Lost Highway?" I asked. "I can call for a tow truck or mechanical assistance when I get to an area with better cell coverage." "I am at mile marker 267, pulled off on the shoulder just past the Moriarty exit," he responded. "There is a truck stop about 5 miles ahead where you could probably get some help. I would really appreciate anything you can do." I checked my atlas and confirmed that I would be passing his location in about 40 minutes. Mile marker 267 was indeed just past the Moriarty exit, in a stretch of highway that I knew was pretty desolate at night. I told Lost Highway that I would stop and see if there was anything I could do to help. As I approached mile marker 267, I slowed down and started looking for his disabled truck. The area was exactly as isolated as I had expected. Just empty desert on both sides of the highway with no buildings or other vehicles in sight. But I could not see any broken down truck on the shoulder. I keyed my CB radio again. "Lost Highway, this is Desert Eagle. I am at mile marker 267, but I do not see your rig. Are you sure about your location?" "Desert Eagle, I can see your headlights," came his immediate response. "I am pulled off about 200 yards ahead on your right. You should see me any second now. I continued driving slowly, scanning the shoulder for any sign of a disabled truck, but the highway remained empty. After another mile, I tried the radio again. Lost Highway, I have passed mile marker 268 and I still do not see you. Can you flash your lights or give me some other landmark? This time, his response was different. His voice was colder, more calculated. Desert Eagle, why do not you take the next exit and double back? I am definitely here and I really need your help. Something about his tone made me uneasy. In 15 years of trucking, I had helped countless drivers in distress, and they were always grateful and apologetic about the inconvenience. Lost Highway sounded too calm, too controlling. My instincts told me that something was not right about this situation. Instead of taking the next exit as he had suggested, I continued eastbound and got on the CB to see if any other drivers had heard from Lost Highway or seen his disabled truck. Breaker 19, this is Desert Eagle looking for any drivers who might have seen a breakdown near mile marker 267 westbound, I called out. The response I got chilled me to the bone. It came from a driver using the handle Roadmaster who sounded like an older, experienced trucker. Desert Eagle, you need to stay away from that area, Roadmaster said urgently. The voice you have been talking to does not belong to any stranded driver. There have been reports about that same call sign and similar distress calls for the past 6 months. 3 drivers have gone missing after responding to requests for help from someone using that handle. My blood ran cold as I processed what Roadmaster was telling me. Are you saying Lost Highway is not a real trucker in distress? Asked. That is exactly what I am saying, Roadmaster confirmed. The state police have been investigating a series of incidents where drivers have disappeared after receiving CB calls for help in remote areas. The MO is always the same. Someone claiming to be broken down in an isolated location asking for assistance, then luring Good Samaritans into a trap. As if he had been listening to our conversation, Lost Highway's voice came back on the radio, but now all pretense of being in distress was gone. Desert Eagle, I know you are still out there, he said with a voice that made my skin crawl. You passed right by me and now you are talking to other drivers about me. That was not very neighborly of you. The fact that he had been watching me drive by proved that he was indeed in the area but obviously not disabled or in need of help. I was dealing with someone who used the CB radio to hunt for victims among the trucking community. Roadmaster, I think this guy has been watching me, I radioed. He knows I drove past his supposed location and he is still trying to get me to come back. Get out of that area as fast as you can, Roadmaster advised. Contact the state police as soon as you have cell coverage and report the incident. This predator has been using our own communication system against us. Over the next several hours, as I continued toward my destination, other truckers joined the conversation on Channel 19. What I learned was terrifying. The person calling himself Lost Highway had been targeting long-haul drivers for months, using different variations of breakdown scenarios to lure them to remote locations. According to the information shared by other drivers, his method was to monitor CB traffic and identify solo drivers traveling through isolated areas late at night. He would then call for help using plausible scenarios, mechanical breakdowns, medical emergencies, or requests for directions that would appeal to the helpful nature of the trucking community. The 3 drivers who had disappeared were all experienced professionals who would normally be cautious about stopping in remote areas. But the CB radio created a false sense of security because they believed they were helping a fellow trucker in genuine distress. One driver, handle Mountain Man, shared that he had actually encountered Lost Highway in person 3 weeks earlier. He had responded to a similar distress call near Flagstaff and found a man standing beside what appeared to be a disabled pickup truck. But when Mountain Man offered to help, The man pulled out a weapon and demanded that Mountain Man get out of his truck. Mountain Man had managed to escape by driving away at high speed, but not before getting a good look at the perpetrator. He described him as a middle-aged white male with a scraggly beard, driving a dark-colored pickup truck with CB equipment that he used to impersonate stranded drivers. The state police eventually caught the man responsible for the lost highway incidents. His real name was Dale Kruger, and he was a former truck driver who had lost his commercial license after multiple DUI arrests. He had been using his knowledge of trucking culture and CB protocols to target drivers for robbery and worse. The investigation revealed that Kruger had murdered at least 2 of the missing drivers and seriously injured several others. He would use their CB radios and truck identification to continue his scam until the heat became too intense in one area, then move to a different state and start over. The case changed how many truckers use their CB radios. While the sense of community and mutual support remains strong, drivers are now more cautious about responding to calls for help in remote areas, especially from unfamiliar voices or call signs. I still use my CB radio every day, and I still believe in helping fellow drivers when they are genuinely in need. But the Lost Highway incident taught me that predators can exploit even the most positive aspects of human nature. Sometimes the voice asking for help belongs to someone who should never be trusted, and the road that leads to a fellow trucker in distress can actually lead straight into a trap. The highway remains a place where strangers help strangers survive the long, lonely miles between destinations. But we must remember that not everyone on the airwaves has honorable intentions, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who speak our language and know our culture well enough to use it against us. My name is Lisa, and I am from Washington. The experience I am about to share with you happened 3 years ago during one of the most emotionally devastating nights of my life. I was forced to drive through a stretch of highway that locals had warned me about for years. A road where travelers reported encounters with spirits who refused to rest. What happened to me that night changed my understanding of death, grief, and the unfinished business that can keep souls tethered to this world long after their bodies have given up. My younger brother Michael had been battling cancer for 2 years, and despite every treatment available, his condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse. I received the call from the hospital at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, telling me that Michael was not expected to survive until morning, and that I needed to come immediately if I wanted to say goodbye. The drive from Seattle to the small town of Centralia normally takes about 2 hours, but the most direct route includes a 15-mile stretch of Highway 12 that has an unsettling reputation among locals. This particular section of road winds through dense forest and crosses several old bridges, and for decades people have reported encounters with hitchhikers, phantom vehicles, and apparitions of accident victims who died along that route. Under normal circumstances, I would have taken a longer alternate route to avoid that notorious stretch of highway, especially late at night when most of the supernatural encounters reportedly occur. But with Michael dying, I could not afford to add an extra hour to my journey. Every minute counted, and I was willing to risk whatever supernatural experiences others had encountered if it meant reaching my brother's bedside while he was still alive. I left Seattle just after midnight, driving my Honda Accord through empty city streets and onto the interstate. The weather was typical for November in Washington, cold, damp, and foggy, with a light rain that made visibility challenging even with my windshield wipers running constantly. As I drove south, I tried to prepare myself emotionally for what I would find when I reached the hospital. Michael and I had always been close despite our 6-year age difference. When our parents divorced when I was 16, Michael and I became each other's primary source of stability and support. We had promised each other that we would always be there for each other, no matter what challenges life brought our way. The thought of losing him was unbearable, but I knew that being present during his final moments was the most important thing I could do for him. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I reached the beginning of the haunted stretch of Highway 12. The fog had grown thicker as I left the interstate and entered the forested area, and my visibility was reduced to maybe 50 yards in any direction. The road was completely empty, no other vehicles in either direction, no roadside businesses, just dense woods and the occasional glimpse of old bridges and abandoned buildings through the mist. I was about 5 miles into this section when I first noticed the elderly woman in my passenger seat. She simply materialized beside me without any sound or warning, as if she had been there all along and I was just now noticing her presence. My initial reaction was startled surprise, but strangely I did not feel frightened or threatened by her appearance. The woman appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pinned back in a neat bun and wearing a dark blue dress that looked like it was from the 1950s or 1960s. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring straight ahead through the windshield with a peaceful expression on her face. She seemed completely solid and real, not translucent or ghostly like I would have expected from a supernatural encounter. "Good evening, dear," she said in a gentle voice that reminded me of my own grandmother. "I hope you do not mind the company. It gets quite lonely waiting by the roadside, and it has been such a long time since I have had someone to talk with." Despite the impossibility of the situation, I found myself responding naturally to her presence. "I do not mind at all," I replied, though I have to admit I was not expecting to pick up a passenger tonight. She smiled warmly and nodded. "I am sure this is quite surprising for you. My name is Dorothy, and I have been traveling this road for quite some time now, waiting for the right person to help me complete my journey." As we continued down the foggy highway, Dorothy began to tell me her story. She had lived in Centralia for most of her adult life, working as a nurse at the same hospital where my brother was currently dying. In 1962, she had been driving home from a late shift when her car had skidded on a patch of black ice and crashed into one of the bridge abutments along this stretch of highway. "I died instantly," she explained matter-of-factly, "but I never made it to where I was supposed to go next. I had made a promise to my grandson that I would be there when his time came, but I died before I could keep that promise. So I have been waiting on this road ever since, hoping to find someone who could help me reach him." I was beginning to understand why Dorothy had appeared in my car specifically. "Your grandson, is he at the hospital in Centralia?" I asked. "He is," she confirmed. "His name is Michael Patterson, and he is very sick. I promised him when he was a little boy that I would never leave him alone when he needed me most. Even death should not break a promise made to someone you love." My heart nearly stopped. Michael Patterson was my brother's full name, though he had always gone by Michael Davis after our mother remarried. But Patterson had been his original surname, our father's name before the divorce. "Dorothy, I think your grandson is my brother," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am driving to the hospital right now because Michael is dying tonight." Dorothy turned to look at me directly for the first time, and I could see tears in her eyes. "Then you must be Lisa," she said. "Michael used to tell me stories about his big sister who always looked out for him. He said you were the strongest person he knew, and that he hoped he could be brave like you if he ever had to face something really difficult." I had never heard Michael mention a grandmother named Dorothy, but as she continued talking, I realized why. Dorothy had died when Michael was only 3 years old, too young to retain clear memories of her. But she had been there during his earliest years, caring for him while our mother worked, singing him to sleep and making the kind of promises that grandmothers make to children they love unconditionally. "He does not remember me," Dorothy said sadly. "But I have been watching over him his whole life, even though I could not be physically present. When I learned he was sick, I started waiting on this road, hoping someone would come along who could help me reach him in his final moments." As we approached Centralia, Dorothy began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing mile, but her voice remained clear and comforting. "Tell Michael that Grandma Dorothy kept her promise," she said. "Tell him that he was never alone, not even when he felt scared or abandoned. I have been with him every step of the way, and I will be waiting for him when he is ready to let go." Dorothy disappeared completely just as I pulled into the hospital parking lot, but I could still feel her presence somehow, as if she was walking beside me as I hurried through the lobby and up to Michael's room. I found him awake and alert, despite what the doctors had told me about his condition. "Lisa, you made it," he said with a weak smile. "I was hoping I could hang on until you got here." I sat down beside his bed and took his hand. "Michael, I have a message for you from someone who loves you very much. Grandma Dorothy wants you to know that she kept her promise, and that you have never been alone." Michael's eyes widened with surprise and then filled with tears. "Grandma Dorothy? But how could you know about her? I barely remember her." "She has been watching over you your whole life," I explained. "She has been waiting for this moment so she could be here when you need her most." Over the next few hours, as Michael peacefully slipped away, I could sense Dorothy's presence in the room with us. She had finally completed her decades-long journey and fulfilled the promise she had made to a 3-year-old boy who needed to know he was loved. Michael passed away just before dawn, with a peaceful smile on his face and my hand holding his. The nurses said they had never seen someone transition so calmly, as if he was being welcomed by someone he trusted completely. I have driven that stretch of Highway 12 several times since Michael's death, but I have never again encountered Dorothy or any other supernatural presence. I believe she fulfilled her purpose and was finally able to move on to whatever comes after this life, knowing that she had kept her word to the little boy she loved. The experience taught me that love transcends death, and that the promises we make to each other can be powerful enough to keep us connected across impossible distances and years of separation. Sometimes the people who appear in our lives when we need them most are not coincidental encounters, but the fulfillment of promises made long ago by souls who refuse to abandon those they love.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight, we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true Pacific Northwest horror stories that will make you question what really lurks in the misty forests and isolated coastlines of America's most enigmatic region. These are not works of fiction, but documented accounts gathered from individuals who experience the inexplicable in places where the boundary between civilization and wilderness remains dangerously thin. Each story has been compiled from first-hand testimonies, historical records, and investigative research that reveal the darker side of this beautiful but unforgiving landscape. The Pacific Northwest has always harbored mysteries that defy rational explanation. And perhaps some truths are better left buried in the depths of those ancient woods and cold waters. If you appreciate genuine horror content rooted in reality that will stay with you long after the video ends, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the unexplained phenomena that most people refuse to acknowledge. After experiencing these 7 chilling encounters, we invite you to share your own Pacific Northwest experiences or thoughts in the comment section below. Now settle in and prepare yourself as we uncover the darkness that dwells in the shadows of the evergreen forests and fog-shrouded shores. Harold Whitmore had dedicated 23 years of his life to the North Cascades National Park when October of 1987 arrived with an unusual chill that seemed to settle deep into the ancient rock formations. He was not a man prone to superstition or flights of fancy. His career had been built on practical knowledge of wilderness survival, meticulous attention to weather patterns, and an unwavering commitment to the safety of every visitor who passed through the park's entrance. Harold had conducted dozens of search and rescue operations over the years, pulling injured hikers from treacherous slopes and guiding lost tourists back to civilization. He thought he had seen everything the mountains could throw at him. He was wrong. The call came through on a Friday afternoon, shortly after 3 o'clock. Harold was finishing paperwork at the ranger station when dispatch informed him that a family had failed to return from what was supposed to be a simple day hike along the Cascade Pass Trail. The Hendersons, Robert, age 42, his wife Patricia, age 39, and their daughter Jennifer, age 16, had checked in with the station early that morning. Robert Henderson had seemed particularly enthusiastic about the hike, telling Harold they were celebrating Jennifer's birthday with a weekend camping trip. They planned to hike to Cascade Pass, take some photographs, and return to their campsite at Pelton Basin by sunset. When they had not returned by nightfall, and their empty tent remained undisturbed at the campground, the camp host had grown concerned enough to notify park authorities. Harold assembled a search team immediately. The weather forecast was troubling. A rare early-season storm system was moving in from the Pacific, bringing with it the threat of snow at higher elevations. The temperature had already dropped 15 degrees since morning, and thick clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks like a gray shroud being drawn across the sky. Harold knew that if the Hendersons were injured or lost somewhere on that trail, they would be facing a dangerous night in conditions that could turn deadly very quickly. He gathered 5 experienced rangers, equipped them with emergency medical supplies, high-powered flashlights, and radio equipment, then led them up the trail as the last light of day began to fade from the western sky. The Cascade Pass Trail was one of the most popular hiking routes in the North Cascades, a 7.5-mile round trip that gained 2,800 feet in elevation. The trail wound through dense old-growth forest before emerging above the tree line into alpine meadows that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Harold had hiked this trail hundreds of times. He knew every switchback, every rocky outcrop, every stream crossing. As the search team made their way up the darkening trail, calling out the Henderson family's names, Harold felt an unusual sense of unease that he could not quite explain. The forest seemed too quiet. The usual sounds of birds settling into their evening roosts were absent. Even the wind moving through the trees had a hollow, mournful quality that set his nerves on edge. They searched through the night, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like pale fingers reaching into shadow. The temperature continued to drop. By midnight, Harold's breath was forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air, and a light snow had begun to fall. The fresh powder covered the trail, obscuring any footprints the Hendersons might have left behind. Harold divided his team into pairs, assigning each pair a section of the trail to search thoroughly while maintaining radio contact. He took the upper section himself, climbing toward Cascade Pass as the snow fell more heavily around him. The beam of his flashlight illuminated millions of swirling snowflakes, creating a disorienting effect that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. It was nearly 3 in the morning when one of the search teams radioed Harold with news. They had found something near the 4-mile marker, a day pack partially hidden beneath an overhanging rock. Harold hurried down the trail to their location, hope surging in his chest. Perhaps the Hendersons had taken shelter somewhere nearby. Perhaps they had simply gotten turned around in the growing darkness and were waiting out the night until conditions improved. When Harold reached the location and examined the day pack with his flashlight, his hope began to curdle into something else. The pack was a blue Eddie Bauer model, relatively new, and contained items that clearly belonged to the Henderson family. There was a wallet with Robert Henderson's driver's license and credit cards. There were granola bars and a half-empty water bottle. Most significantly, there was a camera, a Canon AE-1 35mm with a telephoto lens. What disturbed Harold was not what the pack contained, but where it had been found. The pack was sitting upright against the rock face, carefully positioned as though someone had deliberately placed it there. It had not been dropped or abandoned in haste. The zipper was closed. The items inside were neatly organized. It looked like someone had wanted the pack to be found, had positioned it specifically to catch the attention of anyone searching this area. Harold felt his skin prickle despite the cold. He carefully removed the camera from the pack and examined it. The film counter indicated that 23 of the 36 exposures had been used. Whatever had happened to the Henderson family might be documented on that roll of film. The search continued through Saturday and into Sunday. The storm intensified, dumping 8 inches of snow on the higher elevations and forcing Harold to call in additional personnel and equipment. A helicopter was dispatched from the nearest Coast Guard station, equipped with thermal imaging cameras to scan the mountainside for any sign of body heat. Trained search dogs were brought in to track the family's scent from their abandoned campsite. The local media picked up the story, and soon Harold found himself coordinating not just a search and rescue operation, but managing the dozens of volunteers who showed up wanting to help find the missing family. The Hendersons' relatives arrived from Seattle, desperate and terrified, pleading with Harold to do everything possible to bring their loved ones home. On the 3rd day of searching, a dog handler made a discovery that turned Harold's stomach. Near the edge of a steep cliff face, approximately half a mile past where the backpack had been found, the dogs located several items that had clearly belonged to the Henderson family. There was a red fleece jacket that Patricia Henderson had been wearing, according to her sister's description. There was a baseball cap with a Seattle Mariners logo that had belonged to Robert. Most disturbing of all, there was Jennifer's birthday necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small heart pendant that her parents had given her that morning. The items were scattered near the cliff edge, as though they had been deliberately removed and left behind. The cliff dropped away into a rocky gorge nearly 200 feet below, where a narrow stream cut through boulders covered in moss and ice. Harold organized a technical rescue team to rappel down into the gorge. If the Hendersons had fallen from the cliff, their bodies would be somewhere in that rocky maze below. The rappel team spent hours searching every crevice and hollow, but they found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no indication that anyone had fallen or been injured in that location. It was as though the Henderson family had simply removed their belongings, left them at the cliff edge, and vanished into thin air. Harold had never encountered anything like this in his entire career. People did not just disappear without leaving some trace, some evidence of what had happened to them. The film from the camera was developed on Monday morning at a photo lab in nearby Marble Mount. Harold sat in a small room at the ranger station, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. as he slowly went through the stack of photographs, one by one. The first images showed exactly what he expected to see. The Hendersons had documented their drive to the park, their arrival at the campground, Jennifer smiling and holding up a birthday cake decorated with 16 candles. There were photos of the trail itself, the morning sun filtering through the tall Douglas firs, Patricia pointing at a patch of wildflowers that had somehow survived into the late season. Robert had photographed a deer they had encountered near the 2-mile marker. Jennifer had taken several selfies with the mountain peaks visible in the background. Then, the photographs changed. Image number 14 showed the family stopped on the trail, posing together with their arms around each other. Behind them, barely visible between 2 large cedar trees, was the shape of a person. The figure was too far away and too obscured by shadow to make out any details. But Harold could clearly see that someone had been watching the Henderson family from the forest. He felt his pulse quicken as he moved to the next photograph. Image 15 showed Patricia and Jennifer together, both smiling at the camera while Robert presumably took the shot. The figure in the background had moved closer. It was now standing at the edge of the trail, perhaps 50 feet behind the 2 women. Still too distant to see clearly, but definitely human in shape, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing. Harold's hands were shaking slightly as he continued through the photographs. With each image, the mysterious figure drew nearer to the Henderson family. In photo 18, the figure was only about 30 feet behind them, though they still seemed completely unaware of being followed. Harold could make out more details now. The person was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that seemed wrong for the season and the terrain. There was something about the figure's posture that struck Harold as off, unnatural, like someone moving in a way that human joints were not meant to move. In photo 20, the figure had closed the distance to perhaps 15 feet. Robert had taken a picture of Jennifer pointing at something off the trail, her face bright with excitement. The figure stood directly in the center of the frame behind her, closer now than seemed possible given the timing between shots. Then Harold reached photograph number 23, the final image on the roll, and his blood ran cold. This photo showed all 3 members of the Henderson family posing together. Someone else must have taken this picture. Someone who had offered to capture a family moment on their daughter's 16th birthday. They were standing close together, smiling at the camera with the beautiful alpine landscape spread out behind them. And standing directly behind the family, close enough to reach out and touch them, was the figure that had been following them through the forest. For the first time, Harold could see the face clearly. Except there was no face. Where the figure's head should have been was only a smooth, featureless expanse of what looked like pale leather stretched tight over bone. The figure's impossibly long arms hung at its sides, fingers extending down past where its knees should be. It was standing so close to the Henderson family that its shadow should have been falling across them. Yet, in the photograph, there was no shadow. The thing cast no darkness of its own. Harold stood up from his chair so quickly that he knocked his coffee cup to the floor, where it shattered into pieces that spread across the linoleum like broken teeth. He walked to the window and stared out at the mountains, trying to steady his breathing, trying to process what he had just seen. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps the image was a trick of light and shadow, a photographic artifact, double exposure from a camera malfunction. But Harold had been looking at wilderness photographs for more than 2 decades. He knew what camera errors looked like. What he had just seen was not an error. Something had been following the Henderson family up that trail. Something had gotten close enough to stand directly behind them while someone took their final photograph. And that something had led them to the cliff edge, where their belongings were found, scattered across the rocks. The investigation continued for 3 more weeks. Federal authorities were brought in. The FBI opened a missing persons case. Search teams combed through hundreds of square miles of wilderness, checking every trail, every cave, every possible location where 3 people might have taken shelter or met with an accident. They found nothing. Robert, Patricia, and Jennifer Henderson had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. The case eventually went cold, filed away in a cabinet full of other mysteries that the mountains refused to explain. The official conclusion was that the family had likely fallen from the cliff, and their bodies had been carried away by the stream or covered by rockfall in the gorge below. Harold knew this conclusion was false, but he had no evidence to support an alternative theory. He could not very well tell his superiors that he believed the Henderson family had been taken by something that should not exist, something that appeared in photographs with no face and cast no shadow. Harold requested and was granted a transfer to Olympic National Park the following spring. He could not continue working in the North Cascades, not after what he had seen in those photographs. For years afterward, he would wake in the night from dreams of that faceless figure standing in the forest, its impossibly long fingers reaching toward him through the darkness. He kept copies of the photographs locked in a safe deposit box at his bank, unable to destroy them, but equally unable to look at them again. The original prints and negatives were sealed in an evidence locker somewhere in Seattle, forgotten by everyone except Harold himself. On his final day working at the North Cascades Ranger Station, Harold drove up to Cascade Pass one last time. It was early morning, and the summer sun was just beginning to illuminate the high peaks. He stood at the trailhead where the Henderson family had begun their hike 7 months earlier, looking up at the trail as it wound its way through the forest toward the alpine meadows above. Harold thought about Robert Henderson's enthusiasm that October morning, about the birthday cake with 16 candles, about Jennifer's silver necklace lying on the rocks at the cliff edge. He thought about the camera's final image and the thing that had followed them through the trees as Harold turned to walk back to his truck. Movement at the edge of the forest caught his eye. For just a moment, barely a heartbeat, he saw a tall, thin figure standing between 2 cedar trees, exactly where it had been in photograph number 14. The figure was watching him with a face that had no features, no eyes, no mouth, nothing but smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. Then Harold blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving behind only shadows and the whisper of wind through the branches. Harold got into his truck and drove away from the North Cascades for the last time. He never returned to that place, and he never spoke publicly about what he had seen in those photographs or what he had witnessed at the trailhead on his final morning. The Henderson family remains missing to this day. 3 names on a long list of people who walked into the wilderness and never came back. Search and rescue teams still operate in the North Cascades, still patrol the trails, still respond when hikers fail to return from the mountains. But Harold knows, even if no one else does, that some disappearances cannot be explained by bad weather or poor planning or simple misfortune. Sometimes people vanish because something in those ancient forests decides to take them. Sometimes the mountains claim what they want, and no amount of searching will ever bring those people home. The photographs remain locked away in Harold's safe deposit box, rarely seen and never shown. On quiet nights, when sleep will not come, Harold sometimes thinks about that final image of the Henderson family smiling together, with the faceless figure standing behind them. He wonders if they ever saw what was following them. He wonders if they had any warning at all before the end came. Most of all, he wonders how many other families have posed for similar photographs in similar places, completely unaware of what stands behind them in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reach out with those impossibly long fingers and pull them into a darkness from which there is no return. Mabel Crawford had worked as a night shift caretaker at the Paradise Inn on Mount Rainier for 15 years before she first encountered what the local indigenous tribes called the Keeper. She was 63 years old, a widow with grown children who had long since moved away to cities where opportunity seemed more plentiful than in the isolated mountain communities of Washington state. Mabel had taken the caretaker position not out of necessity, but out of preference. She enjoyed the solitude of winter nights when the Grand Lodge stood empty and silent, when the only sounds were the settling of old timber and the wind moving across the snowfields outside. She had never been afraid of being alone. That would change. The Paradise Inn was a magnificent structure built in 1916, constructed from massive cedar logs and local stone, designed to accommodate the wealthy tourists who came to experience the majesty of Mount Rainier during the summer months. The building sat at 5,400 feet of elevation, surrounded by alpine meadows that exploded with wildflowers in July and August, but lay buried beneath 30 feet of snow during the long winters. The inn closed to guests each year in October and did not reopen until late May, leaving a 7-month period when the building required minimal maintenance and security. That was where Mabel came in. She lived in a small apartment in the inn's service wing, making her rounds through the empty corridors 3 times each night, checking for burst pipes, monitoring the heating system, ensuring that the structure weathered the harsh mountain winters without suffering damage that would be expensive to repair come spring. Mabel had grown accustomed to the creaks and groans that old buildings make, especially during winter when temperatures plunged well below zero and ice formed thick layers on the windows. She knew which floorboards squeaked, which doors swung open if not properly latched, which sections of the building were colder than others due to the vagaries of the heating system. She could navigate the entire inn in darkness if necessary. Though she always carried a heavy flashlight during her rounds, its beam cutting through the shadows as she moved from room to room, floor to floor, checking off items on her nightly inspection list. The work was not difficult, merely monotonous, and Mabel found a certain comfort in the predictable routine. It was during the 3rd week of February in 1994 that the routine shattered. A massive winter storm had moved in from the Pacific Ocean, bringing with it winds that howled across the mountain like the voices of angry spirits. Snow fell so thickly that Mabel could not see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero, and the entire structure groaned under the assault of wind that seemed determined to tear the building from its foundation. Mabel had weathered many storms during her years at the Paradise Inn, but this one felt different. There was a quality to the wind that reminded her of screaming, and the darkness beyond the windows seemed to press against the glass, as though it were a living thing trying to force its way inside. Mabel began her midnight rounds as usual, starting from her apartment and working her way through the service areas before moving into the main lodge. The grand lobby was a cavernous space, 3 stories tall, with massive log beams supporting the ceiling and a stone fireplace large enough to walk inside. During the summer months, this space would be filled with guests, with laughter and conversation and the warm glow of firelight. Now it stood empty and cold, her flashlight beams seeming small and inadequate as it swept across the expanse of shadow. Mabel checked the main doors, confirmed they were securely locked, then moved toward the staircase that led to the guest room corridors on the upper floors. That was when she heard the footsteps. They came from directly above her head, a slow, measured pace moving across the ceiling of the lobby. Mabel stopped walking and tilted her head upward, listening carefully. The footsteps continued, moving from the east side of the building toward the west, following the path of the second-floor corridor. Mabel felt her heartbeat quicken. There should be no one else in the building. The road to paradise was closed, had been closed for months, buried beneath snow that would not be cleared until April at the earliest. The only way to reach the inn during winter was by snowshoe or cross-country skis, a journey of several miles through treacherous terrain. No one would make that journey in the middle of a winter storm. No one could make that journey. Mabel climbed the stairs to the second floor, her flashlight held steady despite the trembling in her hands. She emerged into the corridor and swept her beam along the length of the hallway. Empty. The doors to the guest rooms were all closed, just as they should be. The footsteps had ceased. Mabel stood perfectly still, listening, but heard only the wind battering against the building and the rapid beating of her own heart. She walked slowly down the corridor, checking each door to ensure it remained locked. Everything was secure. Nothing was out of place. Yet Mabel could not shake the certainty that she had heard someone walking above her head, someone whose footsteps had a weight and solidity that could not be explained by settling timber or expanding metal pipes. She completed her rounds and returned to her apartment, telling herself that the storm was playing tricks on her perception, that isolation and darkness could make anyone imagine things that were not really there. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at her small kitchen table, waiting for her nerves to settle. The wind continued its assault on the building, and somewhere in the darkness outside, something crashed with enough force that Mabel jumped in, her chair spilling hot tea across her hand. She cleaned up the mess and decided to go to bed early, pulling thick blankets over herself and trying to ignore the sounds of the storm. Sleep did not come easily. Mabel lay awake, listening to the building around her. And that was when she heard the footsteps again. They were in the corridor directly outside her apartment door, pacing back and forth with that same slow, measured rhythm. Mabel sat up in bed, her breath coming in short gasps. She could see the thin line of space beneath her door, and as she watched, a shadow moved across that space, blocking the faint light that came from the emergency exit sign at the end of the hallway. Someone was standing just outside her door. Someone was pacing back and forth mere feet from where she lay in bed. Mabel forced herself to get up, to cross the small room, to put her hand on the doorknob. She took a deep breath and pulled the door open quickly, her flashlight raised like a weapon. The corridor was empty, completely empty. But there, on the floor directly in front of her door, were footprints. They were wet, as though someone had walked through deep snow and then come inside without bothering to remove their boots. The footprints were impossibly large, each one nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions spread wider apart than human toes should be. The prints led down the corridor toward the main building, leaving a wet trail across the worn carpet. Mabel followed the footprints with her flashlight beam, They continued to the end of the service corridor, turned right into the main hallway, and proceeded toward the grand lobby. As Mabel followed, she noticed that the footprints were not tracking snow or mud into the building. The wetness on the carpet was clear, like water, but it carried with it an overwhelming smell of pine and decay, of old growth forest and things that had died and rotted beneath trees that had stood for 1,000 years. The scent was so strong that Mabel had to cover her nose and mouth with her sleeve, fighting the urge to gag. The footprints ended at the wall opposite the grand staircase. They simply stopped, as though whoever or whatever had been walking had stepped directly through the solid log wall and disappeared. Mabel stood staring at the wall, her flashlight illuminating the ancient wood, and she felt something that she had not experienced in many years. She felt genuine fear, the kind that makes rational thought difficult and turns the stomach to ice. She backed away from the wall, turned, and hurried back to her apartment, locking the door behind her and pushing her dresser in front of it for good measure. She sat on her bed for the remainder of the night, fully dressed, flashlight in her lap, waiting for dawn to come. The storm finally broke on the third day, and Mabel used the satellite phone in the office to call the Park Service headquarters in Longmire. She reported what she had experienced, trying to keep her voice steady, trying not to sound like a frightened old woman who had let her imagination run wild during a winter storm. The ranger who took her call was polite but skeptical. He assured her that he would send someone up to check on her as soon as the roads could be cleared, which might take several days depending on conditions. Mabel thanked him and hung up the phone, knowing that no one would believe what she had witnessed. That night, the footsteps returned. Mabel heard them moving through the upper floors, pacing the corridors, climbing the stairs to the third floor where the most expensive suites were located. She heard doors opening and closing, heard the scrape of furniture being moved across wooden floors. She forced herself to investigate, driven by a stubborn refusal to be terrorized in a building where she had worked safely for 15 years. She climbed to the third floor and found chaos waiting for her there. Every door along the third floor corridor stood wide open. Furniture had been pulled out of the rooms into the hallway, chairs and tables and bed frames arranged in a pattern that Mabel could not understand. The arrangement formed a rough circle, with all the furniture facing inward toward a space at the center of the corridor. In that central space, written on the floor in what appeared to be water or melted snow, was a symbol that Mabel did not recognize. It looked ancient, like something that might have been carved into stone by people who lived in these mountains long before Europeans arrived with their maps and their names and their buildings. Mabel stood at the top of the staircase, staring at the impossible scene before her. And that was when she felt it. There was a presence in the corridor with her, something massive and old and utterly inhuman. She could not see it, but she could feel its attention focused on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The temperature in the corridor dropped so precipitously that her breath became clouds of vapor. The lights flickered, and then, written across the walls in letters that dripped and ran like water, words appeared: "Leave this place." Mabel did not sleep that night. She sat in her apartment with every light turned on, waiting for morning, wondering how she could possibly explain what was happening to anyone who had not witnessed it themselves. When dawn finally came, she packed a bag with essential belongings and prepared to abandon her post, to walk away from the job and the isolation and the thing that had made its displeasure with her presence abundantly clear. But before she could leave, Mabel decided she needed to understand what she was dealing with. She needed to know why this was happening. She drove down the mountain as soon as the road was passable, traveling to the park headquarters where she requested access to the historical archives. The clerk was surprised to see her, but granted her request, leading her to a storage room filled with boxes of old documents, photographs, and records dating back to the early days of the park. Mabel spent hours searching through yellowed papers and fading photographs until she found what she was looking for. The Paradise Inn had been built on land that local indigenous tribes considered sacred. The meadows around the building were not simply beautiful alpine landscapes. They were ceremonial grounds, places where important rituals had been conducted for generations before the arrival of white settlers. The tribes had protested the construction of the inn, had warned that building on sacred ground would anger the spirits that protected the mountain. Their warnings had been ignored. The inn was built anyway, and the tribes were pushed further from their ancestral lands. But according to the documents Mabel found, several construction workers had reported strange occurrences during the building process. Tools disappeared. Materials went missing. Men claimed to see a tall figure watching them from the tree line, a figure that left tracks in the snow too large to be human. Mabel found references to the Keeper, a spirit that the tribes believed guarded Mount Rainier from those who would disrespect the mountain or desecrate sacred places. The Keeper was described as ancient beyond measure, neither fully of the physical world nor entirely spirit, something that existed in the spaces between. The Keeper did not harm those who treated the mountain with respect, but it drove away those who did not belong, those who took without giving, those who built without asking permission. Mabel returned to the Paradise Inn with offerings. She brought cedar branches and tobacco, items that the indigenous people had traditionally used in their ceremonies. She arranged the offerings in the grand lobby and spoke aloud to the emptiness, apologizing for the intrusion, acknowledging that she and all the others who worked at the inn were guests on land that did not belong to them. She promised to treat the building and the mountain with greater respect, to remember that she was living in a place that had been sacred long before it had been turned into a tourist destination. The footsteps stopped after that night. The furniture was never moved again. The doors remained closed and locked as they should be. Mabel completed her contract that winter and returned for many winters after. She never again heard the footsteps in the corridors above her head, never again saw the impossibly large tracks in the wet snow. But on certain nights when the wind blew cold across the mountain, Mabel would sometimes catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows at the edge of the forest. A tall figure standing among the trees, watching the inn with an attention that felt both protective and warning. The Keeper was still there, still guarding the sacred ground, still making its presence known to those who had the wisdom to pay attention. Doris Elkhart moved to the isolated logging town of Cedar Creek in the spring of 1991, drawn by the promise of affordable housing and the kind of quiet mountain living that had become impossible to find in the rapidly growing cities of Western Washington. She was 57 years old, recently retired from a career in elementary education, and eager to spend her remaining years in a place where the pace of life moved slower and neighbors still knew each other by name. Cedar Creek seemed perfect for her needs. The town consisted of fewer than 200 permanent residents, most of them connected in one way or another to the logging industry that had sustained the community for nearly a century. The houses were modest but well maintained. The main street featured a general store and a small diner, and the surrounding forest pressed close on all sides, creating a sense of peaceful isolation that Doris found deeply appealing. The people of Cedar Creek were welcoming enough when Doris first arrived. Her neighbors helped her move furniture into the small two-bedroom house she had purchased at the end of Maple Street. The woman who ran the general store learned her preferences and made sure to stock the brands of tea and coffee that Doris favored. The men who gathered at the diner each morning for breakfast nodded politely when she came in for her occasional meal. Yet despite this surface friendliness, Doris sensed something guarded in the way the townspeople interacted with her. Conversations would stop abruptly when she entered a room. People exchanged meaningful glances that she could not interpret. There was a sense of secrets being kept, of information being withheld, of a community that had closed ranks around something they did not want outsiders to know. Doris attributed this guardedness to the natural suspicion that small towns often harbored toward newcomers. She assumed that with time and patience, she would be accepted more fully into the community's social fabric. She volunteered at the small local library, helped organize a cleanup day at the town's only park, and made genuine efforts to establish relationships with her neighbors. The townspeople remained polite but distant, friendly on the surface, but careful never to let her get too close. Doris found this frustrating, but not entirely unexpected. She told herself that earning true acceptance in a place like Cedar Creek would take years, not months. Then autumn arrived, and with it came mention of the Harvest Festival. Doris first heard about the festival in late September when she stopped by the general store to purchase supplies. The owner, a woman named Margaret Simmons, who had lived in Cedar Creek her entire life, was discussing arrangements with several other longtime residents. They spoke about food preparation, about coordinating schedules, about ensuring that everything would be ready when the time came. When Doris asked about the festival and whether she might be able to attend or help with preparations, the conversation stopped immediately. Margaret looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances with the other customers before explaining in carefully chosen words that the Harvest Festival was a private community event, limited to families who had lived in Cedar Creek for multiple generations. Newcomers, she said with an apologetic smile, were not invited to participate until they had resided in the town for 7 full seasons. It was tradition, Margaret explained, nothing personal. Doris was surprised by this explanation, but tried not to take offense. She understood that rural communities often maintain traditions that seemed strange to outsiders. 7 seasons seemed like an arbitrary and excessive waiting period. But she supposed that every town had its peculiarities. She thanked Margaret for explaining and left the store, dismissing the matter as just another example of small-town insularity. But as October progressed, Doris noticed that the atmosphere in Cedar Creek began to change. The townspeople became increasingly distracted and excited, speaking in hushed tones about the upcoming festival. Children were kept close to home after school. The logging crews began working shorter hours, returning from the forest earlier each day. There was a sense of anticipation building, a feeling of something important approaching that had nothing to do with Halloween or any holiday that Doris recognized. The Harvest Festival was scheduled for the night of the new moon in late October, a date that seemed deliberately chosen to coincide with the darkest night of the month. On the day of the festival, the entire town shut down. The general store closed early. The diner served its last meal at noon and locked its doors. Doris watched from her front porch as her neighbors prepared to leave their homes, dressed in simple dark clothing and carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. They walked in small family groups toward the edge of town, where a trail led deep into the surrounding forest. No one spoke. No one made eye contact with Doris as they passed. By nightfall, Cedar Creek was completely empty, except for Doris herself. Sitting alone in her house and wondering what kind of festival required the entire population to disappear into the woods in the middle of the night. Curiosity overcame caution. Doris had never been comfortable with being excluded, and the secrecy surrounding the Harvest Festival had grown from mildly annoying to genuinely disturbing. She told herself that she simply wanted to understand the community she had chosen to join, that observing the festival from a distance would help her appreciate the traditions that were clearly so important to the people of Cedar Creek. She put on dark clothing, grabbed a flashlight that she kept switched off, and set out along the trail that led into the forest. The night was moonless and profoundly dark. The tall trees blocked what little starlight penetrated the cloud cover, and Doris had to move carefully to avoid tripping over roots and rocks that she could barely see in the darkness. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she began to see a glow through the trees ahead. Firelight, flickering and dancing, illuminating the trunks of ancient cedars and casting shadows that moved like living things across the forest floor. Doris could hear voices now, many voices, chanting in unison. The words were not in any language she recognized. They had a rhythmic quality, rising and falling in patterns that seemed designed to match the crackle and roar of what must be a very large fire. Doris left the trail and moved through the underbrush as quietly as she could, approaching the source of the light from an angle that would allow her to observe without being seen. What Doris saw when she reached the edge of a large clearing took her breath away and filled her with an immediate and overwhelming sense of wrongness. The entire population of Cedar Creek had gathered in a natural amphitheater formed by massive cedar trees, some of which had to be hundreds of years old. In the center of the clearing burned a bonfire of extraordinary size, flames reaching 30 feet into the air and throwing off waves of heat that Doris could feel even from her concealed position at the edge of the tree line. The townspeople had arranged themselves in concentric circles around the fire, all facing inward, all chanting in that strange language that resonated in Doris's chest and made her teeth ache. At the very center of the gathering, closest to the fire, stood what appeared to be 5 large human figures. They were constructed from bundles of branches and brush, bound together with rope and positioned upright on wooden frames that kept them standing despite their awkward construction. Each figure was roughly 8 feet tall, shaped to suggest a human form with outstretched arms and a rounded head. They were clearly effigies, representations of human shapes meant to be burned in the fire as part of some ritual that Doris did not understand. She had read about similar practices in various cultures. Symbolic burnings meant to represent the end of harvest season or the warding off of winter's darkness. The sight was unsettling but not immediately alarming. Then the chanting changed. The rhythm accelerated, becoming more urgent, more frenzied. The townspeople began to move, swaying in place, some of them dancing with jerking movements that looked more like seizures than coordinated motion. Margaret Simmons, the kindly store owner who had always been so pleasant to Doris, stepped forward from the crowd. She was carrying something in her arms, something wrapped in white cloth. Other people came forward as well, each carrying similar bundles. They approached the 5 effigies and began unwrapping the cloth, revealing what lay beneath. Doris felt her stomach lurch and had to clap a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The bundles contained bones, human bones, skulls and rib cages and long bones from arms and legs, old and yellowed with age, but unmistakably human. The townspeople were carefully positioning these bones within the effigies, weaving them into the framework of branches and brush, transforming what Doris had thought were simple symbolic figures into something far more disturbing. These were not representations of humans. These were structures built around actual human remains. The effigies were not purely symbolic. They were monuments to death, reliquaries constructed from the bodies of people who had died in ways that Doris could not begin to imagine. Margaret Simmons began to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. She was not speaking in the strange language anymore, but in perfectly ordinary English, with the same friendly tone she used when helping customers at the general store. She spoke about prosperity and protection, about the bargain that had been struck generations ago when the logging industry had first come to this valley. She spoke about the forest spirits who had ruled these woods since time immemorial, ancient powers that demanded tribute in exchange for allowing humans to take the trees that were their children. She spoke about the 5 founders of Cedar Creek, the original loggers who had discovered the ritual and performed it first, who had given themselves willingly to the forest so that their descendants could prosper and the logging could continue without disaster or ruin. The chanting resumed, louder now, building towards some crescendo that Doris desperately did not want to witness. The townspeople began feeding the effigies into the bonfire, one at a time, lifting the heavy structures and carrying them forward until they could tip them into the flames. The first effigy hit the fire with an explosion of sparks and a sound like screaming. Though whether the sound came from burning wood or something else, Doris could not be certain. The smell that rose from the fire was nauseating. A combination of burning pine and something far more organic, far more disturbing. It was the smell of burning bone, of flesh that had long since dried and mummified, but still contained enough organic material to produce that distinctive stench of cremation. Doris knew she had to leave, had to get away from this place before she was discovered. If the townspeople found her here, witnessing their secret ritual, their carefully guarded tradition, she did not think they would simply escort her home with a polite warning to mind her own business. She began to back away from the clearing, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. She had made it perhaps 50 feet when her foot came down on a dry branch that snapped with a crack like a gunshot. The chanting stopped instantly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Doris froze, not daring to breathe, knowing that hundreds of eyes were now searching the darkness at the edge of the clearing. A voice called out. It was Margaret Simmons again, but her tone was no longer friendly. She called for people to search the perimeter to find whoever was hiding in the trees. Doris heard movement, heard people crashing through the underbrush on either side of her position. She abandoned any attempt at stealth and ran, crashing through the forest in blind panic, her only thought to reach the trail and get back to town before they caught her. She could hear them behind her, calling to each other, coordinating their search. They knew these woods far better than she did. They could navigate in the darkness that left her stumbling and disoriented. Doris was not sure how she found the trail. Perhaps instinct guided her, or perhaps simple luck allowed her to blunder onto the path just when her pursuers were closing in. She ran harder than she had run in decades, her lungs burning, her heart hammering in her chest. She could still hear them behind her, but could not tell how close they were or how many. When she finally burst out of the tree line and into the empty streets of Cedar Creek, she did not stop running. She ran straight to her house, slammed the door behind her, and locked every window and door. She pulled her curtains closed and sat in the darkness, listening, waiting to hear footsteps on her porch or fists pounding on her door. The footsteps never came. No one knocked. As dawn broke over Cedar Creek, Doris watched through a crack in her curtains as her neighbors returned from the forest, walking in small groups, speaking quietly to each other, looking like ordinary people returning from an ordinary community event. They dispersed to their homes and disappeared inside. By mid-morning, the town seemed completely normal. The general store opened. The diner began serving breakfast. It was as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Doris packed her belongings that day. She loaded everything she could fit into her car and drove away from Cedar Creek without looking back, abandoning the house she had purchased and the quiet life she had hoped to build. She never reported what she had seen. Who would believe her? What evidence did she have beyond her own testimony? She had no photographs, no proof. Nothing but memories of fire and bones, and the faces of ordinary people engaged in something that should not exist in the modern world. Years later, Doris would sometimes see news stories about Cedar Creek, about the logging operations that continued to thrive there while other timber towns struggled and failed. She would see photographs of the town and recognize faces, people who had been in that clearing, people who had fed human remains into a bonfire while chanting to forest spirits. They looked so normal in the photographs, so ordinary and harmless. But Doris knew better. She knew what they were capable of, what they had done to ensure their prosperity. She knew about the bargain their ancestors had struck and the terrible price that had been paid to keep that bargain alive. Eugene Pemberton served as the lighthouse keeper at Cape Perpetua for 37 years before his mysterious disappearance in March of 1989. He was a man of habit and routine, qualities that served him well in a profession that demanded absolute reliability and attention to detail. The lighthouse at Cape Perpetua stood on a rocky promontory that jutted into the Pacific Ocean, a towering white structure that had guided ships safely past treacherous coastal rocks since 1874. Eugene had inherited the position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Pembertons had kept the light burning, had maintained the station, had watched over the dangerous waters where the Oregon coast met the full fury of the Pacific. Eugene lived alone in the keeper's cottage adjacent to the lighthouse tower. His wife had passed away in 1982, and his children had long since moved to inland cities, where employment opportunities were more abundant. He did not mind the solitude. In fact, he preferred it. The isolation of the lighthouse station suited his temperament perfectly. He kept meticulous records of weather conditions, ship traffic, and maintenance activities. His logbooks were models of precision and clarity, documenting every detail of his daily routine with an almost obsessive thoroughness that his superiors in the Coast Guard had come to depend upon. In early March of 1989, Eugene's logbook entries began to change. The first unusual notation appeared on March 3rd. Eugene wrote that he had observed a sailing vessel approaching the lighthouse at approximately 2 a.m. The ship was a 3-masted schooner, running with full sails despite the calm conditions and lack of wind. Eugene had attempted to contact the vessel by radio, but received no response. He noted that the ship's running lights appeared unusually dim, and that its course seemed erratic, as though the captain was uncertain of the proper heading. The ship had eventually turned away from the coast and disappeared into the darkness. Eugene concluded the entry by noting that no vessel matching that description was listed on any of the shipping schedules he maintained, and that weather conditions at the time made sailing under full canvas both unusual and unnecessary. The The second entry came on March 5th. Eugene reported seeing the same schooner again, this time approaching even closer to shore. He described the vessel in greater detail, noting that its sails appeared to be made of canvas that was badly weathered and stained. The ship's hull showed signs of extensive damage, with visible gaps in the planking near the waterline. Eugene wrote that he had again attempted radio contact with no success. This time, however, he reported hearing voices calling out from the ship. The voices were speaking, but Eugene could not identify the language. He wrote that it sounded older than words, a phrase that his supervisor would later find particularly unsettling. The ship had once again turned away before reaching the rocks, sailing back out to sea despite the fact that Eugene could observe no wind strong enough to fill its sails. Over the next week, Eugene's entries became increasingly detailed and increasingly disturbing. The schooner appeared every night, always between the hours of midnight and dawn, always approaching the lighthouse before turning away at the last moment. Eugene began to recognize individual crew members on the deck of the ship. He described them as wearing clothing that seemed decades out of date. Heavy wool coats and caps that reminded him of photographs he had seen from the late 19th century. The crew members would call out to him, their voices carrying clearly across the water despite the distance and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. Eugene still could not understand the words they spoke, but he became convinced that they were trying to communicate something important. On March 10th, Eugene's entry took a dramatic turn. He wrote that he had finally been able to make out some of what the crew was saying. They were calling his name over and over again. Voices from the ship were calling Eugene Pemberton across the dark water. The captain of the vessel, a tall figure who stood at the wheel on the quarterdeck, had raised his hand and beckoned to Eugene, gesturing for him to come aboard. Eugene wrote that he had felt an almost overwhelming compulsion to respond to that gesture, to leave the lighthouse and find some way to reach the ship that called to him every night. He resisted the compulsion, he wrote, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. The March 12th entry was even more alarming. Eugene reported that the crew had been asking him to join them for 6 consecutive nights. He wrote that the captain had called out to him in perfect English, explaining that they had been sailing these waters since before the lighthouse was built. Eugene described seeing the faces of the crew members clearly for the first time, illuminated by lanterns that cast a pale greenish light across the deck of the schooner. He recognized those faces. They belonged to men who had died during the construction of the lighthouse in 1874. Workers who had fallen from the scaffolding or been swept into the sea by rogue waves. Eugene knew their names from the memorial plaque that had been installed at the base of the lighthouse tower. Thomas Whitmore, Samuel Chen, Patrick O'Brien, James Newcastle. 15 men in total who had perished before the lighthouse was completed. Eugene's penultimate entry was brief and chilling. He wrote that he now understood why the dead men kept returning to Cape Perpetua. The lighthouse had been built on ground that should have remained empty. The rocky promontory was a sacred site, a place where indigenous peoples had conducted ceremonies for the dead for countless generations before white settlers arrived and claimed the land for their own purposes. The spirits of the men who died building the lighthouse could not rest because the structure itself was an intrusion, a violation of sacred ground. They were trapped between life and death, sailing eternally along a coastline they could never leave, calling out to the living in hopes of finding someone who could understand their plight. The final entry in Eugene Pemberton's logbook was dated March 14th, 1989. The handwriting was shaky, less precise than Eugene's usual careful script. He wrote that the ship had approached closer than ever before, so close that he could have thrown a stone and hit its hull. The captain had called to him again, inviting him to join the crew. Eugene wrote that he could see now that the captain was his own grandfather, Jeremiah Pemberton, who had supposedly retired from the lighthouse service in 1923 and moved to Portland, where he had died of pneumonia in 1925. But here was Jeremiah standing on the deck of the ghostly schooner, looking exactly as he appeared in the old photographs that Eugene kept in his cottage. Jeremiah explained that he had never actually left Cape Perpetua, that the lighthouse keepers never truly left, that they all eventually joined the crew of the ship that sailed these waters forever. Eugene's final words were, "They have been asking me to join their crew for 6 days now. The captain says they have been sailing these waters since before the lighthouse was built. I can see their faces clearly now. They are the men who died building this place in 1874. Tonight, I understand why they keep returning. Tonight, I will give them the answer they have been waiting for." Coast Guard investigators arrived at Cape Perpetua on March 16th after Eugene failed to respond to scheduled radio check-ins. They found the lighthouse in perfect operational order. The light was functioning properly, the lens was clean, all equipment was maintained to the exacting standards that Eugene had always upheld. His cottage was neat and organized, with no signs of struggle or distress. His coat still hung on its peg by the door. His breakfast dishes from March 14th were washed and put away. The logbook sat open on his desk to the final entry. Eugene Pemberton himself was nowhere to be found. A thorough search of the station and the surrounding area revealed no trace of the missing keeper. There were no footprints leading away from the lighthouse, no indication that Eugene had packed belongings or prepared to leave. The only boat at the station remained tied to the small dock, undamaged and unused. Eugene had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but his carefully maintained records and that final cryptic entry in his logbook. The Coast Guard officially classified Eugene's disappearance as unexplained and eventually presumed him dead after the statutory period elapsed. The lighthouse was automated shortly thereafter, no longer requiring a human keeper to maintain its operation. But local fishermen who work the waters off Cape Perpetua report that on foggy nights, particularly during the dark of the moon, they sometimes see a figure standing in the lighthouse tower. The figure waves at passing ships, warning them away from the dangerous rocks below, keeping watch over the coastline just as Eugene Pemberton did for 37 years. And occasionally, very occasionally, fishermen report seeing a 3-masted schooner sailing through the fog near Cape Perpetua. The ship runs with full sails despite the absence of wind, its crew visible on deck, calling out in voices that sound like wind and waves and grief. Those who claim to have seen the ship say that among the crew is a figure who looks remarkably like the photographs of Eugene Pemberton that were published in newspapers after his disappearance. He stands at the rail, watching the lighthouse he once tended, forever sailing the waters he spent his life making safe for others, unable to leave the place that claimed him in the end. Gladys Morrison volunteered for a university psychological study in the winter of 1993 that required spending 6 weeks alone in a remote cabin in the Olympic National Forest. She was 61 years old, a retired librarian with no close family ties, and a genuine curiosity about the limits of human endurance in isolation. The study was being conducted by researchers from the University of Washington's Psychology Department, investigating the effects of complete solitude on cognitive function, emotional stability, and sensory perception. Gladys had read about similar experiments and found the concept fascinating. The compensation was generous, and more importantly, she would be contributing to scientific understanding of how the human mind coped with extended periods of alone time. The researchers explained the protocol in detail during the preliminary meetings. Gladys would be taken to a cabin located approximately 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail. The cabin was equipped with basic necessities: a wood stove for heating, a propane stove for cooking, sufficient food supplies for the entire 6-week period, water from a nearby spring, and a chemical toilet. There would be no electricity, no telephone, no contact with the outside world except for weekly radio check-ins with the research team. During these check-ins, which would occur every Sunday at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Gladys would answer a series of standardized questions about her mental state, her sleep patterns, and any unusual experiences or observations. The researchers would monitor her responses for signs of psychological distress, and if necessary, they could terminate the experiment early and extract her from the location. Gladys signed the consent forms and underwent a complete physical and psychological evaluation to ensure she was suitable for the study. The researchers seemed satisfied with her baseline assessments. She was intelligent, emotionally stable, and had realistic expectations about the challenges of extended isolation. In early January, on a gray morning when frost covered every surface and her breath formed clouds in the cold air, Gladys was driven to the trailhead and escorted to the cabin by 2 research assistants who carried her supplies and explained the operation of the radio equipment one final time. Then they left, and then Gladys found herself alone in a way she had never experienced before. The first week passed more easily than Gladys had anticipated. She established a routine that gave structure to her days. She woke with the dawn, prepared a simple breakfast, spent the morning reading from the selection of books the researchers had provided, took a walk in the afternoon to gather firewood and observe the forest around her, prepared dinner, and spent the evening writing in the journal she had been asked to maintain. The silence was profound, but not oppressive. Gladys found that she enjoyed the absence of human noise, the constant background hum of civilization that she had lived with for her entire life without really noticing until it was gone. The second week brought the first signs of difficulty. Gladys began to notice that the silence was not truly complete. The forest was full of sounds: wind moving through the trees, branches creaking, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the distant call of birds. Her mind began to interpret these natural sounds in strange ways. A falling pine cone became footsteps on the cabin roof. The wind rattling a loose shutter became someone trying to open the door. Gladys understood that this was a normal psychological response to isolation, exactly the kind of phenomenon the researchers were interested in studying. She made detailed notes in her journal and reported these experiences during her Sunday radio check-in. The researchers assured her that auditory misinterpretation was common and expected. They told her to continue documenting these experiences, but not to be alarmed by them. By the third week, the sounds had evolved into something more distinct. Gladys was hearing voices. They came at night, after she had extinguished the lantern and lay in her narrow bed, listening to the darkness. The voices were faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but they grew clearer with each passing night. They seemed to be coming from just outside the cabin. speaking in conversational tones too low for Gladys to make out specific words. She knew this was likely an auditory hallucination, a product of her isolated brain trying to create the human interaction it was being denied. She found the voices more fascinating than frightening, and she began to listen carefully, trying to determine if there were patterns in the sounds her mind was generating. During her third Sunday check-in, Gladys reported the voices to the research team. She described them clinically, using the precise language of someone who understood that she was experiencing a psychological phenomenon rather than an actual external stimulus. The lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Chen, seemed pleased with Gladys's observations. She explained that auditory hallucinations were a well-documented response to sensory deprivation and social isolation. Dr. Chen assured Gladys that as long as she maintained awareness that the voices were not real, there was no cause for concern. The experiment would continue as planned, but the voices did not remain ambiguous for long. By the fourth week, Gladys could understand what they were saying. There were three distinct voices: a woman, a man, and a child. They were talking to each other, carrying on mundane conversations about daily activities and simple observations about the weather and the forest. The woman's voice reminded Gladys of her own mother, who had passed away 15 years earlier. The man spoke with a gentle tone that suggested kindness and patience. The child, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years old based on the pitch and cadence of her speech, asked questions with the innocent curiosity that Gladys remembered from her years working with children in the library. Gladys began to respond to the voices. At first, she simply acknowledged them, saying good evening when they appeared after dark, offering simple replies when they seemed to address her directly. The voices responded in turn, becoming more animated, more engaged. They introduced themselves. The woman was Margaret. The man was Thomas. The child was Susan. They told Gladys that they had lived in this part of the forest long ago, that they had been a family here before something terrible happened. They did not specify what that terrible thing had been, but Gladys sensed profound sadness in their voices when they spoke of it. By the beginning of the 5th week, the voices had become constant companions. They spoke to Gladys throughout the day, not just at night. Margaret would comment on the meals Gladys prepared, offering suggestions for how to improve the flavor with herbs that grew near the cabin. Thomas would discuss the weather, warning Gladys when storms were approaching. Susan would ask Gladys to read aloud from her books, and Gladys would comply, finding comfort in the act of reading to an audience, even if that audience existed only in her own mind. She knew, on some level, that she was losing her grip on reality. She knew that healthy people did not have extended conversations with hallucinations. But she also felt less lonely than she had at any point in the experiment. And loneliness, she reasoned, was far more dangerous than friendly voices. The scheduled check-in on the 5th Sunday revealed the extent of Gladys's deterioration. When Dr. Chen asked the standard questions about unusual experiences, Gladys spoke enthusiastically about her new friends. She described Margaret, Thomas, and Susan in detail, explaining how helpful they had been, how much comfort their presence provided. Dr. Chen's voice over the radio became tense. She asked Gladys directly whether she understood that these individuals were not real. Gladys hesitated, then admitted that she was no longer certain. The voices seemed real enough. They knew things that Gladys did not know, like where to find the best firewood or which berries near the cabin were safe to eat. How could hallucinations possess knowledge that she herself did not have? Dr. Chen made the decision to terminate the experiment immediately. She told Gladys that a team would arrive the following morning to escort her back to civilization. Gladys agreed calmly, but after the radio check-in ended, Margaret's voice spoke clearly in the cabin. She warned Gladys that the researchers would try to separate them, that leaving the cabin would mean losing the only friends Gladys had. Thomas agreed, his voice taking on an urgent quality. He reminded Gladys how lonely she had been before they arrived, how empty her life would be without their companionship. Susan began to cry, pleading with Gladys not to abandon them. When the research team arrived at the cabin on Monday morning, they found Gladys sitting calmly at the small table, a pot of tea steeping in front of her. She had arranged 3 empty chairs around the table, and she was speaking animatedly to the air as though engaged in conversation with invisible companions. Dr. Chen entered the cabin cautiously, assessing the situation. She called Gladys's name. Gladys turned and smiled, apparently pleased to see her. She gestured to the empty chairs and introduced the researchers to Margaret, Thomas, and little Susan, who were sitting right there. And would they like some tea as well? Dr. Chen attempted to convince Gladys to leave the cabin. She explained gently but firmly that the experiment was over, that Gladys needed to return with them for psychological evaluation and treatment. Gladys listened politely, then shook her head. She explained that she could not possibly leave now. Her friends needed her. They had been alone in this forest for so long, trapped here by the tragedy that had befallen them. Margaret had finally told her the full story just that morning. In the winter of 1932, a family had been caught in a terrible blizzard while hiking through this area. They had taken shelter in a trapper's cabin that had once stood on this very spot. They had frozen to death, waiting for a rescue that never came. Their bodies had not been found until spring. Now their spirits remained here, lonely and frightened, desperate for human contact and companionship. Gladys explained all of this in a calm, rational tone that made her delusion all the more disturbing. She told Dr. Chen that she had decided to stay at the cabin permanently. The experiment was over for the researchers, but it was just beginning for her. She finally had a purpose, a reason to be needed. She would keep Margaret, Thomas, and Susan company. She would make sure they were never lonely again. The research team could report whatever they wanted to report, but Gladys was not leaving. Dr. Chen spent 3 hours trying to reason with Gladys, trying different approaches, different arguments. Nothing worked. Gladys remained adamant that she was staying. Eventually, Dr. Chen made the difficult decision to have Gladys removed from the cabin against her will. It took 2 research assistants to physically guide Gladys out of the cabin, while she protested and called out to her invisible friends, promising them that she would return, that she would not abandon them forever. As they led her down the trail toward civilization and the psychiatric evaluation that awaited her, Gladys kept looking back over her shoulder, tears streaming down her face, reaching toward something that only she could see. Walter Thornton had worked the night shift at Aberdeen's largest sawmill for 14 years, when the winter of 1988 brought a series of brutal murders that would terrorize the small logging community and haunt him for the remainder of his life. He was 59 years old, a shift supervisor responsible for overseeing the skeleton crew that kept the mill running through the dark hours between midnight and 8 in the morning. Aberdeen was a town built on timber, its entire economy dependent on the massive trees that were cut from the surrounding forests and processed into lumber at facilities like the one where Walter worked. The mill ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The screaming of saw blades and the thunder of heavy machinery never ceasing except on Sundays, when even the most dedicated workers rested. The first victim was discovered on the morning of January 12th. Raymond Kowalski, a night shift worker who operated the debarking machine, had failed to show up for his shift that evening. His supervisor assumed he was sick and assigned another worker to cover his station. When Raymond's wife called the mill the following morning to report that her husband had never come home from work, a search was initiated. Raymond's truck was found in the employee parking lot, exactly where he had left it when he arrived for his shift the previous night. Raymond himself was discovered in the lumber yard, his body arranged among stacks of freshly cut 2x4s. Walter was called to the scene, along with the Aberdeen police. What he saw that morning would replay in his nightmares for years afterward. Raymond Kowalski had been killed with deliberate brutality, his body mutilated by what the investigating officers immediately recognized as sawmill equipment. Circular saw marks were visible on his torso and limbs. A lumber hook had been driven through his chest. The killer had used tools that every mill worker handled daily, had turned the instruments of their livelihood into weapons of shocking violence. The police cordoned off the area and began interviewing employees, but no one had seen anything unusual during the night shift. Raymond had simply vanished somewhere between the main building and the parking lot, and no one had noticed he was missing until it was too late. The second murder occurred exactly 1 week later. Martin Deschamps, who ran the planing machine during night operations, was found in a similar condition. His body had been positioned inside one of the massive storage sheds, where finished lumber awaited shipment. The same brutal methodology had been employed. Saw blades, industrial chisels, and the heavy steel hooks used for moving logs had all been used on Martin's body with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity with how those tools functioned. The Aberdeen police brought in detectives from the State Criminal Investigation Division. They established that both victims had worked the same shift, had been employed at the mill for similar lengths of time, and had both been killed using equipment from the facility where they worked. Walter attended both funerals. He had known Raymond and Martin for years, had supervised their work, had shared coffee with them during breaks. The senselessness of their deaths disturbed him almost as much as the brutality. Aberdeen was a small town where violent crime was rare. People knew each other. Doors were left unlocked. Children played outside without supervision. The idea that a killer was stalking mill workers, targeting them in the place where they earned their living, created an atmosphere of fear that settled over the town like fog from the nearby harbor. The third victim was discovered on February 2nd. Thomas Carlisle, a forklift operator on the night shift, was found in the boiler room. The fourth victim, Edward Chen, who worked in the shipping department, was discovered on February 9th in one of the equipment maintenance bays. The fifth victim, James Whitmore, a general laborer, was found on February 16th near the log pond, where raw timber was stored before processing. Each murder followed the same pattern. The victims worked night shift. They were killed with sawmill equipment. Their bodies were positioned in locations around the facility, always hidden, but always eventually discovered. The killers seemed to want the bodies found, seemed to be making some kind of statement that Walter and the investigators could not decipher. The mill owners considered shutting down night operations entirely, but the economic impact would have been devastating. Instead, they implemented new security measures. Guards were posted at all entrances. Workers were required to move in pairs. Police maintained a presence at the facility during night hours. Walter found himself watching his crew with suspicion, wondering if the killer might be someone he worked alongside every night, someone who smiled and joked and seemed completely ordinary, while harboring the capacity for such horrific violence. It was Walter who finally recognized the pattern. He was reviewing personnel files in the mill office, comparing the names of the victims, when he noticed something that the police had apparently missed. All 5 murdered men had been employed at the mill in 1981. All 5 had been working on the day shift on June 17th of that year, the day of the accident. Walter felt his blood run cold as he pulled the incident report from the archives and read through the details he had tried for 7 years to forget. The accident had occurred during routine logging operations at one of the harvest sites 20 miles east of Aberdeen. A massive Douglas fir had been improperly cut, the weight distribution misjudged by the felling crew. When the tree came down, it had fallen in an unexpected direction, crushing Samuel Morrison, a young logger who had been standing in what should have been a safe zone. Samuel had died instantly, his body so badly mangled that the casket at his funeral had been closed. The investigation had ruled the death accidental, the result of human error and the inherent dangers of logging work. No one had been held criminally responsible. The 6 men on the felling crew that day had been given additional safety training and returned to work after a brief suspension. Walter stared at the names on that felling crew list. Raymond Kowalski, Martin Deschamps, Thomas Carlyle, Edward Chen, James Whitmore, and one more name, David Patterson. Walter's hands were shaking as he picked up the phone and called the lead detective on the case. He explained what he had discovered, the connection between all 5 victims, the logging accident from 7 years ago. The detective listened carefully and asked the obvious question. Where was David Patterson now? Walter checked the shift schedule. David Patterson was currently on duty, working the night shift in the mill's main cutting room. The detective told Walter to stay where he was, that police were on their way. But Walter could not stay put. David Patterson was out there with the rest of the night crew, men who had no idea they might be working alongside a serial killer. Walter left the office and made his way through the facility toward the cutting room, the sounds of machinery echoing through the vast space. He found David Patterson standing alone near the largest circular saw, a massive blade that could cut through logs 3 feet in diameter. David was staring at the spinning blade with an expression that Walter could not quite read. Walter approached slowly, calling out David's name to be heard over the noise of the equipment. David turned, and Walter saw that he was crying, tears running down his face while his jaw was set in an expression of terrible determination. In his hand, David held a lumber hook, the same type of implement that had been used to kill Raymond Kowalski. Walter asked David to put down the hook. David shook his head slowly. He asked Walter if he remembered Samuel Morrison. Walter said that of course he remembered. Samuel had been 23 years old, newly married, with a baby daughter he would never see grow up. David said that Samuel had been his cousin, the closest friend he had in the world. David had been the one to find Samuel's body crushed beneath that massive tree. He had been the one to tell Samuel's wife that her husband was never coming home. David explained that the accident had not been an accident at all. The 6 men on that felling crew had been cutting corners, ignoring safety protocols because they were being pressured to meet quotas and maximize productivity. They had known the tree was dangerous. They had known that Samuel was standing too close. They had made the cut anyway, and Samuel had paid the price for their negligence. David had spent 7 years watching those men continue their lives, continue working, continue laughing and joking as though they had not killed his cousin through their carelessness and greed. Walter tried to reason with David, tried to explain that revenge would not bring Samuel back, that David would be throwing away his own life. But David was beyond reason. He had already thrown away his life, he said. He had thrown it away the moment he decided that the men responsible for Samuel's death needed to face justice that the courts had failed to provide. There was only one name left on his list. Only one more man who needed to pay for what had happened on that June day 7 years ago. David raised the lumber hook and stepped toward Walter. And Walter realized with horror that David had not been using an old personnel file to identify the men from the felling crew. David had been there that day. David knew exactly who had been responsible. But David had made one critical error. Walter had not been on the felling crew. Walter had been working at the mill that day, nowhere near the logging site where Samuel Morrison died. Walter pointed this out, his voice steady despite his fear. He told David to check his facts, to look at the personnel records one more time. David hesitated, confusion replacing certainty in his expression. That moment of hesitation gave the police time to arrive, to flood into the cutting room with weapons drawn, to surround David Patterson and order him to drop the lumber hook and surrender. David complied. He set down the hook and allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. As the police led him away, he turned to look at Walter one final time. He apologized for the mistake, for nearly killing an innocent man. He said he had been so certain, so focused on finishing what he had started, that he had not verified the final name on his list. Walter watched David being taken into custody and felt nothing but profound sadness. Another life destroyed by that accident 7 years ago. Another victim of the logging industry's constant demand for productivity and profit. The sixth and final member of the felling crew, whose name Walter never learned, left Aberdeen the night David Patterson was arrested. He disappeared into wherever people go when they are running from the consequences of their actions. The Aberdeen sawmill implemented new safety protocols and held mandatory training sessions on workplace responsibility. But Walter knew that no amount of training would prevent future accidents in an industry where profit would always be prioritized over safety. He worked one more year at the mill and then retired, unable to continue working in a place where he could still see Raymond Kowalski's body among the lumber stacks every time he closed his eyes. Beatrice Hammond had worked as a ferry operator between the San Juan Islands for over 20 years when she first encountered the vessel that would haunt her for the remainder of her career. She was 55 years old in the autumn of 1996, a veteran of the Washington State ferry system who had navigated the treacherous waters of Puget Sound in every kind of weather imaginable. Beatrice knew these waters better than she knew the streets of her own neighborhood. She could judge tide and current by instinct alone, could pilot her vessel through fog so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, could dock at any of the island terminals with a precision that younger operators admired and tried unsuccessfully to emulate. She'd seen nearly everything the sea could throw at her, or so she believed, until that November night when the Phantom Ferry appeared for the first time. The evening had started routinely enough. Beatrice was making the final run of the day from Friday Harbor to Orcas Island, her ferry carrying only a handful of passengers and 3 vehicles. Winter was approaching, and tourist traffic had dwindled to almost nothing. The locals who depended on the ferry system for transportation between islands were accustomed to the reduced schedule and the long, dark evenings that came with the season. Beatrice enjoyed these quiet runs. She could focus on the simple pleasure of navigation, of guiding her vessel through water that reflected the lights of distant towns like scattered stars. The fog rolled in around 8 o'clock, thick and unseasonably dense. Beatrice reduced her speed and switched on the forward searchlights, their beams cutting through the murk and illuminating swirling banks of mist that seemed to have substance and weight. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Beatrice relied on her instruments and her knowledge of the route, following coordinates and depth soundings that told her exactly where she was, even when she could see almost nothing of her surroundings. This was not the first time she had navigated in heavy fog, and it would not be the last. That was when she saw it. A vessel emerged from the fog bank ahead of her, moving on a course that would intersect with her own if neither ship altered heading. Beatrice immediately reduced speed further and reached for her radio to establish contact. She could see that the other vessel was a ferry, but it was unlike any ferry currently operating in the Puget Sound system. The design was old-fashioned, with a profile that reminded Beatrice of photographs she had seen from the 1940s. The ferry's running lights were visible but strangely dim, casting a pale yellow glow that seemed to be absorbed by the fog rather than penetrating it. No name was visible on the hull, and Beatrice could see passengers moving behind windows that were illuminated from within by what appeared to be incandescent bulbs rather than modern fluorescent lighting. Beatrice keyed her radio and called out on the standard maritime frequency, requesting identification and coordination for safe passage. The response came immediately, but the quality of the transmission was poor, filled with static and interference that made the words difficult to understand. A man's voice identified himself as Captain Robert McKinnon of the MV Kalakala, requesting permission to proceed to the Friday Harbor terminal. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of her enclosed bridge. She knew the name Kalakala. Every ferry operator in the Puget Sound knew that name. The MV Kalakala had been an iconic vessel, a streamlined Art Deco ferry that had operated between Seattle and Bremerton for decades before being decommissioned in 1967 and eventually sold to owners in Alaska who had moved it far from its original waters. More importantly, Beatrice knew that Captain Robert McKinnon had died in 1951 when the Kalakala sank during a Christmas Eve storm while attempting an unauthorized crossing to the San Juan Islands. The official investigation had concluded that McKinnon had been attempting to make extra runs during the holiday season, transporting islanders who were desperate to reach their families despite dangerous weather conditions. The ferry had gone down with 43 passengers and crew aboard. There had been no survivors. The wreck had never been located, lost somewhere in the deep waters between the islands where currents and depth made recovery operations nearly impossible. Beatrice stared at the vessel in front of her, her rational mind insisting that what she was seeing could not possibly be real, while her eyes told her a different story. The phantom ferry continued to approach, and Beatrice could now see details that made the impossible nature of the situation even more apparent. The passengers visible through the windows were dressed in clothing from the 1950s. Women wore long coats and hats with veils. Men wore fedoras and heavy wool overcoats. Children pressed their faces against the glass, waving at Beatrice's ferry with the innocent enthusiasm of young travelers excited to be on a boat. None of them seemed to realize that anything was wrong, that they were sailing on a vessel that should not exist, heading toward a destination they would never reach. Captain McKinnon's voice came through the radio again, clearer now. He repeated his request for permission to dock at Friday Harbor. He explained that he was running behind schedule due to the weather that his passengers were anxious to reach the islands before Christmas Eve ended, that families were waiting. Beatrice found herself responding automatically, her training taking over, while her conscious mind struggled to process what was happening. She granted clearance for the Kalakala to proceed, then watched as the Phantom Ferry acknowledged her transmission and altered course slightly, heading toward Friday Harbor on a route that would take it directly past Beatrice's position. The two vessels passed within 100 yards of each other. Beatrice stood at her bridge windows, staring across the dark water at the impossible sight. She could see Captain McKinnon standing at the wheel of the Kalakala, a tall figure in a captain's uniform from another era. He raised his hand in a salute as the vessels passed, a gesture of professional courtesy between mariners. Beatrice raised her own hand in response, unable to do anything else. She watched as the Phantom Ferry continued toward Friday Harbor, its dim lights fading into the fog. Then, just before it disappeared entirely, the vessel simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, solid and real. The next moment it was gone, leaving behind only empty water and swirling mist. Beatrice completed her run to Orcas Island in a state of shock. She said nothing to her passengers or crew, uncertain how to explain what she had witnessed, unsure whether anyone would believe her, even if she tried. She completed her shift and returned to Friday Harbor, where she immediately checked with the terminal staff to see if another ferry had docked while she was making her run. No other vessels had arrived. The harbor had been empty all evening. Beatrice went home and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if exhaustion or stress had caused her to hallucinate the entire encounter. But the Phantom Ferry appeared again. It happened 3 weeks later, on another foggy night during another late run between the islands. The same vessel emerged from the mist. The same voice requested permission to dock. The same impossible sight unfolded before Beatrice's eyes. This time she attempted to photograph the Phantom Ferry with a camera she had brought specifically for that purpose. But the images showed only fog and darkness. The Kalakala refused to be captured on film, as though it existed in a wavelength of reality that cameras could not detect. Over the following years, Beatrice encountered the Phantom Ferry 17 times. The sightings always occurred on foggy nights, usually during the winter months, always when she was making late runs with few passengers aboard. The pattern became familiar. Captain McKinnon would request permission to dock. Beatrice would grant clearance. The vessels would pass. The Phantom Ferry would fade into nothingness before reaching its destination. Beatrice began to recognize some of the passengers visible through the windows. A young woman in a red coat who always stood near the bow. An elderly man who sat in the forward cabin reading a newspaper. A little girl who pressed her face against the glass and waved with both hands. Beatrice eventually shared her experiences with other ferry operators, expecting skepticism or ridicule. Instead, she discovered that she was not alone. Several other veteran operators had encountered the Kalakala over the years, though most were reluctant to discuss their sightings openly for fear of being thought mentally unstable. There was an unofficial understanding among those who worked the waters around the San Juan Islands. On certain nights, when the fog was thick and the sea was dark, Captain McKinnon still made his rounds. He was still attempting to complete that final Christmas Eve run, still trying to bring his passengers home to their families, still hoping that this time he would succeed where he had failed in 1951. Beatrice tried to research the history of the sinking, hoping to understand why the Phantom Ferry continued to appear. She discovered that the Kalakala's final voyage had been unauthorized and desperate. Many of the passengers had been islanders who had traveled to the mainland for Christmas shopping and celebrations, people who had waited too long to return home, and found themselves stranded when the regular ferry service was suspended due to deteriorating weather conditions. Captain McKinnon had taken pity on them, had agreed to make one final run despite warnings from his superiors and the Coast Guard that the crossing was too dangerous to attempt. The ferry had departed Seattle at 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, with 43 souls aboard, all of them eager to reach the San Juan Islands before Christmas morning. Witnesses on shore reported seeing the Kalakala's lights disappearing into the storm, heading north into waters that were being lashed by winds exceeding 50 miles per hour and waves that reached heights of 15 feet. The vessel never arrived at its destination. No distress call was ever received. No wreckage was ever found. The 43 passengers and crew simply vanished, leaving behind grieving families who spent Christmas Day waiting for loved ones who would never return. Beatrice came to believe that Captain McKinnon and his passengers were trapped in a kind of temporal loop, forever attempting to complete that fatal journey, forever hoping that this time they would succeed in reaching the islands and reuniting with their families. She began to feel a profound sadness when the Phantom Ferry appeared, understanding that she was witnessing not just a ghost ship, but a tragedy that replayed itself endlessly, a moment of desperate hope frozen in time and doomed to eternal repetition. On Beatrice's final night working for the ferry system before her retirement in 2003, the Phantom Kalakala appeared one last time. The fog was particularly thick that evening, and Beatrice was making her last run from Friday Harbor to Lopez Island. Captain McKinnon's voice came through the radio with its familiar request for permission to dock. Beatrice granted clearance, as she always did. But this time she added something to her transmission. She thanked Captain McKinnon for his service, for his dedication to bringing people home safely, for his refusal to abandon his passengers, even in death. She told him that she understood his burden, that she honored his commitment, and that she hoped he would someday find the peace that had eluded him for more than 50 years. There was a long pause before Captain McKinnon responded. When his voice came through the radio again, it sounded different, quieter, almost peaceful. He thanked Beatrice for her kindness and her understanding. He said that perhaps it was time to stop trying, time to accept that some journeys cannot be completed, that some destinations remain forever out of reach. The Phantom Ferry passed Beatrice's vessel for the final time, and as it faded into the fog, Beatrice thought she saw the passengers waving goodbye, their faces no longer anxious but calm, as though they had finally accepted where they were and what they had become. Beatrice never saw the Kalakala again, and as far as she knows, neither has anyone else. The Phantom Ferry has not been reported in Puget Sound waters since that night in 2003. Perhaps Captain McKinnon finally found a way to release his passengers from their endless journey. Perhaps they all moved on to whatever lies beyond the fog and darkness that had held them for so long. Or perhaps they are still out there, sailing through dimensions that most people never see, waiting for the right conditions and the right witness to make themselves visible once more.